Grizzly bear mauls. Sheriff and deputy in 5 minutes. June 2nd, 2025. The morning air carried the scent of pine and wildflowers through Swan Valley, Montana on June 2nd, 2025, but beneath the pristine beauty of the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex lay a predator that had been watching, waiting, and growing increasingly aggressive with each passing day. Sheriff Paul Michael Jenkins of Missoula County had awakened at 4:47 a.m. that Sunday morning, his calloused hands wrapping around a steaming cup of black coffee as he reviewed the incident reports that had been piling up on his desk for the past 2 weeks. Bear sightings had increased by 340% in the Swan Valley region compared to the same period the previous year, and what started as routine property damage reports had escalated into something far more sinister and dangerous. Paul Jenkins was a man carved from the wilderness itself, standing 6 feet 2 inches tall, with shoulders broadened by 31 years of law enforcement in some of Montana's most unforgiving terrain. His steel-gray hair, cropped short in military fashion, framed a weathered face marked by decades of mountain sun and bitter winter winds. Born and raised in nearby Kalispell, Paul had spent his entire life in the shadow of Glacier National Park, learning to read the land like others read books, understanding the subtle signs that separated a routine call from a life-threatening emergency. His father, Robert Bobby Jenkins, had been a game warden for Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks for 37 years before retiring, and he had instilled in his son a deep respect for the wilderness and the creatures that called it home, but also a healthy understanding that respect and caution were the only things standing between civilization and the raw, untamed power of nature. Deputy Maria Elena Lopez represented the new generation of law enforcement officers drawn to Montana's wild spaces, but her credentials were anything but inexperienced. At 34 years old, she had served 8 years with the Denver Police Department's Mountain Rescue Unit before transferring to Missoula County 18 months earlier, seeking the challenge and adventure that only Montana's backcountry could provide. Standing 5 feet 6 inches with an athletic build honed by years of rock climbing and backcountry skiing, Maria possessed the kind of instinctive wilderness awareness that couldn't be taught in any academy. Her dark hair was typically pulled back in a practical ponytail that stayed out of her way during long hiking patrols, and her brown eyes held the steady confidence of someone who had rappelled down cliff faces to rescue stranded climbers and navigated through blizzards to reach avalanche victims. Born in Tucson, Arizona, to parents who had immigrated from Guadalajara, Mexico, Maria had discovered her love for mountain environments during college climbing trips to Colorado, eventually leading her to pursue a career that combined law enforcement with her passion for high-altitude rescue operations. The report spread across Paul's kitchen table that morning painted a disturbing picture of escalating bear behavior that went far beyond normal seasonal activity. Harold Hank Morrison, a 73-year-old retired logger who had lived in Swan Valley for 46 years, had called the sheriff's department on May 18th, reporting that something had destroyed his chicken coop with deliberate, calculated violence, unlike anything he had witnessed in nearly 5 decades of mountain living. The damage wasn't the random destruction typical of a hungry bear seeking easy food. Instead, Morrison described finding the birds arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern, with the larger hens positioned in the center and the smaller chickens placed in concentric circles around them, as if the bear had been experimenting or playing with its prey rather than simply feeding. 3 days later, on May 21st, Rebecca Becker Thornton, a 41-year-old wildlife photographer who had been documenting grizzly behavior in the region for her upcoming book, Shadows in the Wilderness, contacted both the Sheriff's Department and Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks to report unprecedented stalking behavior from a large male grizzly she had been observing near Holland Lake. Thornton, whose previous work had been featured in National Geographic and Outdoor Life magazines, described the bear as exhibiting problem bear characteristics that suggested it had lost its natural fear of humans and was actively seeking confrontations rather than avoiding them. Her detailed field notes, accumulated over 17 years of professional wildlife photography, indicated that this particular grizzly was not only unafraid of human presence, but seemed to be studying human behavior patterns, watching from concealed positions as hikers passed by, following at a distance and demonstrating what she called hunting reconnaissance, rather than simple curiosity. Dr. James Jim Patterson, a wildlife behavioral specialist with 32 years of experience studying North American bear populations, had been consulted by Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks after reviewing Thornton's photographs and behavioral observations. Patterson, who held a PhD in animal behavior from the University of Montana and had authored 3 definitive textbooks on grizzly bear psychology, confirmed that the documented behavior patterns suggested a bear that had progressed beyond food conditioning to what he termed predatory habituation, a rare but extremely dangerous condition where a wild bear begins to view humans not as a threat to be avoided or a source of easy food, but as potential prey to be hunted using sophisticated stalking techniques, typically reserved for elk, deer, and other large mammals. The timeline of incidents had accelerated dramatically during the final week of May, creating a pattern that should have served as a clear warning of the tragedy to come. On May 25th, campers at Holland Lake State Park reported finding their tent surrounded by what appeared to be deliberate bear tracks, forming a complete circle, with additional tracks leading to various observation points on nearby ridges, suggesting the bear had spent considerable time studying the campsite from multiple angles before approaching. The campers, a married couple from Bozeman named Thomas and Jennifer Walsh, both experienced outdoors enthusiasts with over 15 years of backcountry camping experience, described waking up to find massive paw prints pressed deep into the soft earth around their tent, with claw marks on nearby trees at heights that indicated a bear of exceptional size and reach. On May 28th, maintenance workers at the Swan Valley Rural Fire Station discovered that something had systematically destroyed their equipment storage shed. But rather than consuming or scattering the contents, as would be typical of a food-seeking bear, the intruder had instead arranged tools and equipment in neat piles, sorted apparently by size and type, leading investigators to conclude that the bear was demonstrating problem-solving intelligence and manipulative behavior that went far beyond normal ursine capabilities. Fire Chief Robert "Bobby" McKenzie, a 26-year veteran of wilderness firefighting who had encountered hundreds of bears during his career, described the scene as the most unsettling thing I've ever seen in the wilderness, noting that the methodical arrangement of human tools by a wild animal suggested cognitive abilities that challenged everything he thought he knew about bear intelligence. The final incident before the fatal encounter occurred on May 30th, when Sandra "Sandy" Coleman, a 58-year-old elementary school teacher from Missoula who maintained a seasonal cabin near Lindbergh Lake, called 911 to report that a massive grizzly bear had spent over 4 hours positioned on her front porch, not attempting to break in or access food sources, but instead appearing to study the interior of her home through the windows with what she described as methodical, deliberate observation. Coleman, who had spent summers in Swan Valley for over 20 years and considered herself experienced with local wildlife, noted that the bear showed no interest in her garbage, bird feeders, or other typical attractants, instead focusing its attention entirely on observing human living spaces and domestic arrangements, as if conducting reconnaissance for future reference. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks had responded to the escalating reports by assigning Conservation Officer Lisa Lee Hamilton, a 15-year veteran with specialized training in problem bear management, to coordinate with local law enforcement for a comprehensive investigation of the situation. Hamilton, whose previous work had involved the capture and relocation of over 200 black bears and 37 grizzlies, recognized the behavioral patterns described in the incident reports as indicative of a bear that had progressed beyond typical human habituation problems to something far more dangerous and unpredictable. Her preliminary assessment, filed on May 31st, recommended immediate area closures and the deployment of specialized bear tracking teams equipped with tranquilizer equipment and GPS collar technology to locate and assess the problem animal before it escalated to human injury or fatality. The weather conditions on June 2nd created perfect circumstances for the tragedy that was about to unfold, with early morning temperatures hovering around 42 degrees Fahrenheit and light fog rolling through the valley floor, reducing visibility to less than 50 yards in many areas, while muffling sounds that might otherwise provide advance warning of approaching wildlife. The atmospheric pressure was dropping steadily as a late spring storm system approached from the west, creating the kind of unsettled conditions that often triggered aggressive behavior in large predators by disrupting their normal hunting and territorial patterns. Wind speeds were minimal, less than 5 miles per hour from the southwest, which would later prove crucial in preventing the sheriff and deputy from detecting the distinctive musky scent that typically provides advance warning of nearby grizzly presence. Sheriff Jenkins had planned to begin the investigation at first light, meeting Deputy Lopez at the department headquarters before driving to the Swan Valley area to examine the most recent incident sites and interview local residents who had reported unusual bear behavior. However, at 6:23 a.m., just as Paul was preparing to leave his ranch-style home on the outskirts of Missoula, his radio crackled with an urgent transmission from Dispatch Supervisor Kathy Williams, a 22-year veteran of emergency communications whose calm professionalism had guided first responders through countless crisis situations throughout western Montana. Unit 7-1, we've got another incident at the Coleman property on Lindbergh Lake Road. Kathy's voice carried the controlled tension that experienced dispatchers use to convey urgency without creating panic. Sandra Coleman is reporting that same large grizzly is back, but this time it's actively trying to gain entry to her residence. She's barricaded inside and requesting immediate law enforcement response. Be advised, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks has been notified, and Conservation Officer Hamilton is en route from Kalispell, ETA approximately 90 minutes. Paul acknowledged the call and immediately contacted Maria, who had been reviewing case files at her small apartment in downtown Missoula, preparing for what they had both expected to be a routine day of witness interviews and site examinations. Within 20 minutes, both officers were on Highway 83 heading north towards Swan Valley, their patrol vehicles equipped with the specialized emergency gear that Montana law enforcement carried when responding to wildlife-related incidents: high-powered flashlights, bear spray, emergency medical supplies, and Paul's personal .300 Winchester Magnum rifle, a weapon he had carried for over 15 years and used successfully to stop 3 previous bear attacks on civilians throughout his career. The drive through the pre-dawn darkness provided an opportunity for Paul and Maria to review their tactical approach to the developing situation, communicating via radio as their vehicles maintained a steady 75 miles per hour along the winding mountain highway. Paul's experience with dangerous wildlife encounters had taught him that successful resolution of bear conflicts required patience, careful observation, and above all, respect for the animal's superior strength, speed, and wilderness advantages. Maria's training with Denver's Mountain Rescue Unit had emphasized the importance of maintaining multiple escape routes and never allowing yourself to become trapped in terrain that favored the wildlife over the human responders. At 7:41 a.m., as the first pale light of dawn began filtering through the dense forest canopy surrounding Lindbergh Lake, both officers arrived simultaneously at the Coleman property, a modest log cabin situated on a small clearing approximately 200 yards from the lake shore and surrounded by dense timber that provided excellent cover for large wildlife. Sandra Coleman met them at her front door, visibly shaken but coherent, explaining that the grizzly had departed approximately 15 minutes before their arrival, moving east toward a section of forest that connected to the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex through a series of game trails and natural corridors that had been used by wildlife for thousands of years. Sandra Coleman, a soft-spoken woman whose silver hair and gentle demeanor belied the steel nerve she had developed during 2 decades of mountain living, provided a detailed account of the morning's events that painted a chilling picture of calculated predatory behavior. "This wasn't like the other times," she explained, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. "Before, he would just watch, like he was curious about what we humans do in our homes. But this morning he was different, more focused, more aggressive. He started with the windows on the north side of the house, the ones that face away from the road, like he knew those would be the hardest for anyone to see from outside." According to Sandra's account, the bear had arrived sometime around 6 a.m., approaching through the forest with a stealth that seemed impossible for an animal estimated to weigh over 800 pounds. Rather than announcing its presence with the heavy footfalls and crashing brush typical of grizzly movement, this bear had appeared at her windows like a shadow, its massive form materializing from the morning fog with a silence that suggested calculated hunting behavior rather than casual curiosity or food-seeking activity. "He went from window to window in a pattern," Sandra continued, her voice growing steadier as she focused on providing the detailed observations that might help the officers understand what they were dealing with. "North side first, then east, then south, like he was checking every possible entrance before committing to a plan of attack. When he got to the kitchen window on the south side, he didn't just look in like before. He started testing the frame, pushing against the glass, trying to find weak points in the structure." The bear's behavior had escalated when Sandra made the mistake of moving from room to room to observe its progress around her home, apparently triggering a response that suggested the animal was not only aware of her presence, but was actively tracking her movements from outside while simultaneously probing for entry points. When Sandra retreated to her bedroom and attempted to call 911, the bear had responded by moving directly to the bedroom window and beginning what she described as deliberate attempts to break in, using its claws to test the window locks and applying steady pressure to the frame until the wood began to creak and flex under the enormous strain. Sheriff Jenkins documented Sandra's account with the methodical thoroughness that had made him one of the most respected law enforcement officers in western Montana, recording not only the chronological sequence of events, but also the specific behavioral details that might provide insight into the bear's psychological state and potential future actions. Maria concentrated on photographing the physical evidence left behind by the bear's visit, using her digital camera to capture detailed images of paw prints, claw marks, and areas where the animal's massive weight had compressed vegetation and soft earth around the cabin's perimeter. The tracks told a story that confirmed Sandra's observations while revealing additional disturbing details about the bear's capabilities and intentions. The front paw prints measured 14 inches in length by 11 inches in width, with claw marks extending an additional 4 to 5 inches beyond the toe pads, indicating an animal of exceptional size even by grizzly standards. More concerning was the pattern of the tracks, which showed clear evidence of strategic movement and tactical thinking as the bear had circled the cabin multiple times, approaching from different angles and varying its route to avoid creating predictable patterns that might be detected by human occupants. Deputy Lopez's previous experience with wildlife tracking allowed her to read the sign like a book, noting the subtle details that separated this encounter from typical bear behavior. "Paul, look at the depth variation in these tracks," she said, kneeling beside a particularly clear print in the soft earth near the cabin's foundation. "This animal is deliberately controlling its weight distribution, placing its feet carefully to minimize noise. That's not instinctive behavior for a grizzly this size. They're typically heavy, loud movers who announce their presence from a long distance. This one is hunting. The claw marks on the cabin's exterior walls and window frames provided additional evidence of the bear's size, intelligence, and aggressive intentions. Unlike the random scratching typical of bears investigating new scents or marking territory, these marks showed clear evidence of systematic probing, with multiple parallel grooves indicating that the bear had used its claws like tools to test the structural integrity of potential entry points. The deepest marks, found on the kitchen window frame, penetrated nearly 2 inches into the solid pine logs, requiring enormous strength and persistence that went far beyond casual investigation. At 8:15 a.m., after completing their initial documentation of the Coleman property, Sheriff Jenkins made the decision that would ultimately lead to the tragic events that followed. Rather than waiting for Conservation Officer Hamilton to arrive with specialized bear tracking equipment and tranquilizer capability, Paul determined that the immediate threat to public safety required aggressive action to locate and assess the problem animal before it could threaten other residents in the sparsely populated valley. His decision was influenced by several factors: the bear's escalating aggressive behavior, the Memorial Day weekend camping season that had brought additional visitors to the area, and weather forecasts calling for the approaching storm system to arrive by late afternoon, potentially grounding aircraft and limiting search and rescue capabilities for several days. "Maria, we can't wait around for Fish and Wildlife to get their act together," Paul said, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades of command decisions in life-threatening situations. "This animal is actively hunting humans now, and every minute we delay gives it more opportunity to hurt someone. We'll track it to its current location, establish a perimeter, and coordinate with Hamilton when she arrives. But we need to know where this thing is and what it's doing right now, not 3 hours from now." Maria's training and experience aligned with Paul's assessment of the situation, recognizing that their primary responsibility was public safety rather than wildlife conservation, especially when dealing with an animal that had progressed beyond normal bear behavior to active predatory stalking of humans. Her mountain rescue background had taught her that successful operations in dangerous terrain required decisive action based on the best available information, even when that information was incomplete or the situation was continuing to evolve in unpredictable ways. The tracking operation began at 8:33 a.m., when both officers, now equipped with full emergency gear including bear spray, emergency medical supplies, GPS tracking devices, and poles, 300 Winchester Magnum rifle, began following the bear's trail eastward from the Coleman property into the dense timber that marked the edge of the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. The tracks were easy to follow initially, as the bear had made no attempt to conceal its route through the soft forest floor, leaving clear impressions in moss, mud, and scattered leaves that indicated a steady eastward movement toward higher elevation terrain. The forest through which they tracked was typical of western Montana's lower elevation wilderness areas, dominated by mature ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and western larch trees that created a dense canopy overhead while allowing relatively open movement at ground level. understory vegetation consisted primarily of huckleberry bushes, serviceberry, and various grasses and wildflowers that provided excellent forage for deer, elk, and the smaller mammals that form the base of the local food web. This diverse ecosystem normally supported a healthy but widely dispersed bear population, with individual grizzlies maintaining territories of 50 to 100 square miles and rarely coming into conflict with human activities. However, the tracking signs observed by Paul and Maria indicated that this particular bear was behaving contrary to normal grizzly territorial patterns, moving through areas that typically supported multiple animals, without showing the scent marking and boundary respect behaviors that prevented conflicts between individual bears. Instead, their quarry appeared to be moving with the confidence and directness of an animal that considered the entire valley to be its personal hunting ground, showing no deference to other wildlife territorial claims or the traditional avoidance behaviors that kept wild animals separated from human activity areas. As they progressed deeper into the wilderness, approximately 1 mile from the Coleman property, the nature of the tracks began to change in ways that should have served as a clear warning of the danger ahead. Rather than continuing in a straight line toward higher elevation terrain, where bears typically retreated when pressured by human activity, the tracks showed evidence that the animal had begun to circle back toward the southwest, moving in a wide arc that would eventually intersect with several popular hiking trails and established camping areas used by recreational visitors to the Swan Valley region. Deputy Lopez was the first to notice the change in tracking patterns, recognizing the tactical implications of the bear's route selection based on her experience with search and rescue operations in similar terrain. "Paul, this animal isn't retreating," she observed, kneeling beside a clear track impression that showed the bear had paused at a natural vantage point overlooking the valley floor. "Look at the depth of this print compared to the others. It stopped here, probably for several minutes, and from this position it has clear sight lines back toward the road and the populated areas we just came from." Sheriff Jenkins moved to Maria's position and studied the track she had identified, immediately recognizing the tactical significance of her observation. The bear had selected a location that provided both concealment and strategic oversight of human activity areas, exhibiting the kind of military-style reconnaissance behavior that suggested intelligence and planning capabilities far beyond normal animal instincts. From this vantage point, the bear could observe vehicle traffic on Highway 83, monitor activity at various lakeside properties, and track the movement of hiking and camping parties without being detected from below. More disturbing was the evidence that the bear had used this observation post multiple times over recent days, as indicated by multiple track sets, scattered scat deposits, and vegetation that had been flattened by repeated periods of lying in wait for extended periods. The accumulated sign suggested that their quarry had been conducting systematic surveillance of human activity patterns in Swan Valley for at least a week, possibly longer, learning the schedules and behavioral patterns of local residents and visitors with the methodical patience of a skilled predator preparing to select its prey. At 9:47 a.m., approximately 2 miles from their starting point and deep enough into the wilderness to be beyond immediate radio contact with dispatch or backup support, Paul and Maria encountered the first direct evidence that they were not merely tracking a dangerous animal, but were themselves being hunted by a predator that had turned the tables on the pursuit. The realization came suddenly and with terrifying clarity when Maria noticed that their own boot prints from earlier in the tracking operation were now overlaid with fresh bear tracks, indicating that the grizzly had doubled back along their route and was following their scent trail with the same systematic precision they had been using to track it. "Jesus Christ, Paul," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible as the full implications of their situation became clear. "This thing is hunting us. It's been following us for God knows how long, staying out of sight, learning our patterns, just like it did with the residents in the valley. We're not the hunters anymore, we're the prey. No, the psychological impact of realizing they had become the hunted rather than the hunters created an immediate tactical shift in their approach to the situation, forcing both experienced officers to acknowledge that their standard law enforcement protocols were inadequate for dealing with a predator that possessed superior wilderness skills, intimate knowledge of the local terrain, and demonstrated intelligence that allowed it to anticipate and counter human tactical decisions. Paul's 31 years of law enforcement experience had never prepared him for a situation where the subject of an investigation possessed to turn the pursuit around and begin stalking the investigators. The discovery of the reverse tracking situation required an immediate reassessment of their tactical options, taking into account their current location deep in wilderness terrain, their limited communications capability, the approaching weather system that would reduce visibility and complicate any potential rescue operations, and the growing evidence that they were dealing with an animal whose behavior patterns defied conventional understanding of grizzly bear psychology and capabilities. Sheriff Jenkins made the decision to establish a defensive position and attempt to re-establish radio contact with dispatch, hoping to coordinate immediate backup support and evacuation assistance before the situation deteriorated further. However, their current location in a heavily forested valley bottom, surrounded by ridges and dense timber, created significant obstacles to radio transmission, limiting their communication range to less than 2 miles under ideal conditions and potentially eliminating contact entirely if the approaching storm system introduced additional atmospheric interference. At 10:12 a.m., as Paul worked to establish radio contact using his patrol vehicle's more powerful communication system back at the trailhead access point, Maria maintained security watch from a position that provided oversight of their immediate perimeter while monitoring the forest for any signs of approaching wildlife. Her mountain rescue training had emphasized the importance of maintaining situational awareness and multiple escape route options when operating in terrain that favored wildlife over human capabilities, but their current position offered limited mobility options due to dense undergrowth and steep terrain features that would significantly slow any attempt at rapid evacuation. The forest around them had grown unnaturally quiet during the previous 30 minutes, with the normal sounds of bird activity, small mammal movement, and insect noise gradually fading to an ominous silence that experienced wilderness travelers recognized as a clear indicator of nearby predator presence. This acoustic warning system, developed through millions of years of evolutionary adaptation, served as nature's early warning network for animals threatened by the presence of major predators, and its activation in their immediate area provided unmistakable confirmation that the grizzly bear was nearby and actively hunting. Deputy Lopez's previous experience with wildlife encounters had taught her to trust these subtle environmental cues that often provided the only advance warning of dangerous situations in wilderness settings. The absence of normal forest sounds, combined with the evidence of reverse tracking they had discovered earlier, created a tactical picture that strongly suggested they were currently within the hunting territory of their quarry and needed to take immediate defensive measures to prevent becoming victims of a predatory attack. At 10:19 a.m., Paul's radio finally crackled to life with a transmission from dispatch supervisor Kathy Williams, whose calm professionalism provided a reassuring connection to the civilized world beyond the increasingly threatening wilderness environment surrounding the two officers. Unit 7-1, your signal is weak but readable. Conservation Officer Hamilton has arrived at the Coleman property and is requesting your current location and tactical status. Be advised, we're receiving weather updates calling for heavy thunderstorms beginning around 1400 hours, with potential for severe weather conditions continuing through Tuesday morning. Paul acknowledged the transmission and provided their current GPS coordinates while requesting immediate backup support and helicopter evacuation capability. Recognizing that their tactical situation had deteriorated beyond the point where two officers, regardless of their experience and training, could safely manage the developing crisis. However, Kathy's response confirmed their worst fears about the limited support options available, given their remote location and the approaching weather system that was already beginning to affect aviation operations throughout western Montana. Unit 7-1. Be advised that helicopter support is currently grounded due to deteriorating weather conditions and will remain unavailable until the storm system passes, potentially 48 to 72 hours. Ground support units are en route, but ETA is approximately 2 hours given current road conditions and the remote nature of your location. Conservation Officer Hamilton is organizing a ground search team with tranquilizer capability, but they cannot reach your current position before 12:30 hours at the earliest. The reality of their isolation hit both officers simultaneously, forcing them to acknowledge that they would need to survive on their own capabilities for at least the next 2 hours while being actively hunted by a predator that possessed every possible advantage in the current environment. Paul's military training from his early years in the Montana National Guard had included survival scenarios, but nothing in his background had prepared him for a situation where the enemy was a super-intelligent grizzly bear that had demonstrated the ability to outthink and outmaneuver experienced human opponents. Maria's mountain rescue experience provided some applicable skills for wilderness survival situations, but her previous encounters with dangerous wildlife had always involved injured or distressed animals seeking to escape human contact, not apex predators that had developed sophisticated hunting strategies specifically designed to target human beings. The psychological pressure of being hunted by an animal that could move through the forest with complete silence while weighing nearly 900 pounds created a level of stress and hypervigilance that threatened to exhaust their mental and physical resources long before help could arrive. At 10:34 a.m., the tactical situation shifted dramatically when both officers simultaneously detected the distinctive musky odor that indicated nearby grizzly presence. A scent so strong and pervasive that it seemed to saturate the air around them and confirm that their stalker was close enough to launch an attack within seconds if it chose to do so. The smell of wild grizzly is unmistakable to anyone who has encountered it before, a combination of wet fur, decaying vegetation, fish, and the indefinable musk that marks the presence of one of North America's most powerful predators. Paul immediately signaled for complete silence and motioned Maria toward a large Douglas fir tree that offered the potential for rapid vertical escape should the bear launch a ground attack, recognizing that their only tactical advantage lay in their ability to climb above the bear's reach and maintain a defensive position until backup support could arrive. However, as they moved toward the designated tree, the forest erupted with a sound that would haunt the nightmares of anyone who survived to remember it, the huffing, woofing challenge call of a massive grizzly bear preparing to attack. The sound came from directly ahead of them, perhaps 30 yards away through the dense timber, indicating that the bear had successfully maneuvered into an attack position while they were focused on radio communications and tactical planning. More terrifying was the realization that the bear's position blocked their most direct escape route back toward the trailhead and their vehicles, forcing them to choose between standing their ground in an exposed position or attempting to flee through unfamiliar terrain that would give the bear every possible advantage in a pursuit situation. Sheriff Jenkins raised his .300 Winchester Magnum rifle and activated the weapon's safety mechanism while simultaneously reaching for the bear spray canister attached to his duty belt, preparing to employ both defensive options depending on how the encounter developed. His hands remained steady despite the adrenaline surge that accompanied the recognition of mortal danger, drawing on decades of training and experience that had conditioned him to function effectively under extreme stress conditions. Maria positioned herself to Paul's left and slightly behind his shooting position, maximizing their defensive firepower coverage while maintaining her own access to bear spray and escape route options toward the large Douglas fir they had identified as their primary defensive position. Her mountain rescue training had included specific protocols for wildlife encounters, emphasizing the importance of appearing large, making noise, and avoiding sudden movements that might trigger a defensive attack from a startled animal. However, the behavioral evidence they had accumulated throughout the morning clearly indicated that this was not a typical wildlife encounter with a startled or defensive animal. Instead, they were facing a predator that had deliberately maneuvered them into a tactical disadvantage and was now preparing to execute a planned attack using superior wilderness skills, intimate knowledge of local terrain, and demonstrated intelligence that had allowed it to consistently outthink human opponents throughout its recent escalation of aggressive behavior. At 10:37 a.m., the grizzly bear emerged from the dense timber like a force of nature given physical form, its massive bulk moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for an animal of its size as it closed the distance between its concealed position and the two officers with terrifying speed and determination. The bear appeared even larger than the tracks and witness descriptions had suggested, standing nearly 4 feet at the shoulder while moving on all fours and displaying the distinctive muscle mass and silver-tipped fur that marked it as a mature male grizzly in his prime territorial years. Paul's first shot, fired from a distance of approximately 25 yards, struck the charging bear center mass in the chest area, a placement that would have immediately dropped any North American game animal of lesser size and constitution. However, the .300 Winchester Magnum bullet, despite its tremendous stopping power and Paul's accurate shot placement, appeared to have no discernible effect on the bear's charge, beyond causing a slight alteration in its approach angle as it continued to close the distance with undiminished speed and fury. The failure of a center-mass rifle shot to stop or even slow the bear's attack provided a terrifying demonstration of the animal's incredible physical resilience and determined aggressive state, confirming that they were dealing with a predator operating at the absolute peak of its predatory capabilities and driven by a level of focused aggression that overrode even severe physical trauma. Paul's military training and decades of law enforcement experience had never prepared him for an opponent that could absorb potentially fatal trauma and continue attacking with undiminished capability. Maria's bear spray deployment came 3 seconds after Paul's rifle shot, sending a concentrated stream of oleoresin capsicum toward the bear's face and respiratory system in an attempt to disrupt its sensory capabilities and force a retreat from the attack. Under normal circumstances, bear spray represents the most effective, non-lethal deterrent available for stopping aggressive bear behavior, with success rates exceeding 90% when properly deployed against bears exhibiting typical territorial or defensive aggression patterns. However, this encounter differed fundamentally from typical bear spray deployment scenarios because their opponent was not exhibiting defensive behavior that could be redirected through sensory disruption, but was instead engaged in active predatory hunting that would continue until either the prey was eliminated or the predator was physically incapacitated beyond the ability to continue the attack. The bear's response to Maria's bear spray deployment demonstrated the difference between dealing with a defensive animal and confronting a committed predator. Rather than retreating or showing signs of respiratory distress, The grizzly briefly shook its head to clear its vision and continued its charge with only a momentary disruption to its forward progress. Paul's second rifle shot fired at a range of less than 15 yards as the bear closed to near contact distance, struck the animal in the upper shoulder area with sufficient force to penetrate deeply into vital organs and cause massive internal trauma that would have quickly killed any normal animal. However, the grizzly's charge continued without significant alteration, powered by adrenaline, predatory focus, and the incredible physical resilience that had allowed its species to survive as apex predators in North America's most challenging environments for thousands of years. The final moments before physical contact stretched into slow-motion clarity that would be burned into Maria's memory for the remainder of her life, as she watched 900 pounds of enraged grizzly bear close the final distance to Paul's position with the inexorable power of an avalanche or volcanic eruption, representing a force of nature that no human technology or training could adequately prepare someone to face and survive. At 10:38 a.m., the grizzly bear made contact with Sheriff Paul Jenkins with an impact that could be heard from over 100 yards away as bone, flesh, and equipment met the full force of one of nature's most powerful predators operating at maximum capability. The sound of the initial impact combined the wet, organic noise of crushing bone with the metallic clash of destroyed equipment and the deeper, more fundamental sound of two vastly different evolutionary paths meeting in direct, violent confrontation. Paul's body was lifted completely off the ground by the force of the bear's initial charge, his 210-pound frame thrown backward nearly 8 feet before striking the trunk of a mature ponderosa pine with sufficient force to crack several ribs and cause severe spinal compression that immediately compromised his ability to coordinate defensive movements. The .300 Winchester Magnum rifle was torn from his grasp during the initial impact and disappeared into the dense undergrowth, leaving him without his primary defensive weapon as the bear prepared to continue its attack. The grizzly's first bite targeted Paul's left shoulder and upper chest area, with canine teeth measuring nearly 3 inches in length, penetrating through his uniform shirt, protective vest, and into the muscle and bone structure beneath, with crushing force that immediately severed major blood vessels and caused massive tissue damage throughout the shoulder girdle. The bear's jaw pressure, estimated at over 1,200 pounds per square inch, compressed and fractured Paul's collarbone, several ribs, and the upper portion of his arm bone, while simultaneously causing severe hemorrhaging from multiple arterial sources. Maria's response to the attack on her partner demonstrated the kind of instinctive courage that separates exceptional law enforcement officers from ordinary individuals, as she immediately abandoned her own defensive position and moved toward the bear, despite the obvious futility of engaging a 900-pound predator in physical combat. Her decision to risk her own life in an attempt to save Paul reflected not only her professional dedication, but also the kind of personal loyalty that develops between partners who have shared dangerous assignments in challenging environments. Her second deployment of bear spray, directed at point-blank range toward the bear's eyes and respiratory system while the animal was focused on mauling Paul, achieved better results than her previous attempt due to the shorter range and the bear's preoccupation with its current victim. The concentrated oleoresin capsicum caused the grizzly to temporarily release its grip on Paul's shoulder and rear back on its hind legs, while pawing at its face in an attempt to clear the chemical irritant from its sensory organs. The temporary disruption provided Maria with a brief window of opportunity to drag Paul away from the bear's immediate reach, but his severe injuries and semi-conscious state made rapid movement impossible, leaving them both exposed to renewed attack once the bear recovered from the chemical irritation. Paul's blood loss from the shoulder and chest wounds was already approaching life-threatening levels, creating bright crimson pools on the forest floor that would serve as scent markers to attract additional predators and scavengers to the attack site. The grizzly's recovery from the bear spray effects occurred more rapidly than Maria had hoped, demonstrating the animal's exceptional physical resilience and determined focus on completing its predatory attack. Within 30 seconds of the chemical deployment, the bear had cleared its vision sufficiently to locate both officers and resume its assault with renewed fury, apparently motivated by pain and irritation, to escalate rather than abandon its attack on the human intruders in its territory. Paul's attempts to maintain consciousness and coordinate defensive actions were severely hampered by blood loss, shock, and the crushing injuries to his upper torso that had damaged vital organs and compromised his respiratory function. His vision blurred and darkened intermittently as his cardiovascular system struggled to maintain blood pressure and oxygen delivery to his brain, despite the massive hemorrhaging from multiple arterial wounds caused by the bear's initial attack. Maria's training and experience provided her with the knowledge that Paul's injuries required immediate medical attention that was simply unavailable in their current location, forcing her to recognize that her primary responsibility had shifted from engaging the bear to attempting evacuation of her critically injured partner before he bled out in the wilderness. However, the continued presence of an active predator made any evacuation attempt extremely dangerous and potentially impossible given Paul's condition and their distance from medical support. At 10:39 a.m., the grizzly bear resumed its attack with focused determination, ignoring Maria's defensive posture and moving directly toward Paul's prone form with the methodical precision of a predator completing its kill. The bear's approach demonstrated none of the random fury typical of defensive wildlife encounters, instead showing the calculated efficiency of an apex predator that had successfully disabled its primary target and was now moving to complete the predation sequence. Paul's final conscious act was to draw his sidearm, a .40 caliber Glock that represented his last hope for stopping the bear's attack and potentially saving both his own life and Maria's. However, his wounded condition and the effects of blood loss severely compromised his ability to aim accurately or maintain weapon control, resulting in shots that went wide of their target and further enraged the already aggressive predator without inflicting significant damage. The bear's final attack on Sheriff Paul Jenkins lasted approximately 45 seconds and involved the kind of systematic mauling behavior that grizzly bears typically reserved for large prey animals like elk or moose, with multiple bite wounds to the head, neck and torso areas accompanied by powerful claw strikes that opened massive wounds throughout his body and limbs. The attack continued until Paul's movement ceased entirely, and the bear's predatory instincts confirmed that its primary target had been successfully eliminated as a threat. Maria's decision to continue fighting, despite the obvious hopelessness of her situation, reflected the kind of personal courage and professional dedication that defined her character, as she maintained defensive actions with her remaining bear spray and attempted to use noise and movement to distract the bear from continuing its attack on Paul's motionless form. Her actions during these critical moments demonstrated exceptional bravery in the face of certain death, prioritizing her partner's welfare over her own survival, even when rational analysis clearly indicated that both officers were beyond rescue. At 10:41 a.m., the grizzly bear turned its attention from Paul's motionless body to Deputy Maria Lopez, approaching her defensive position with the confident, measured pace of a predator that had eliminated all significant threats and was now free to deal with secondary targets at its own discretion. Maria's mountain rescue training had prepared her for dangerous situations involving falls, avalanches, and severe weather. But nothing in her background provided applicable skills for surviving a predatory attack by a 900-pound grizzly bear operating at maximum aggressive capability. Her final radio transmission, sent on the emergency frequency at 10:42 a.m., provided dispatch with GPS coordinates and a brief description of the tactical situation that would later prove crucial for locating the attack site and coordinating recovery operations. Dispatch, Unit 7-2, Emergency Traffic. Grizzly attack in progress. GPS coordinates follow. Officer down, need immediate medical evacuation and armed backup. This animal is actively hunting humans and has killed Sheriff Jenkins. I don't think I'm going to make it out of here. D. The bear's attack on Maria demonstrated the same systematic predatory behavior that had characterized its assault on Paul, with initial contact designed to disable her mobility and defensive capabilities before proceeding to the fatal mauling sequence that would eliminate her as a potential threat. However, Maria's smaller size and greater agility allowed her to avoid the bear's initial charge and maintain defensive positioning for nearly 2 minutes before the animal's superior size, strength, and wilderness capabilities finally overwhelmed her ability to resist. Her final moments, reconstructed later from physical evidence and her radio transmissions, indicated that she continued fighting and attempting to coordinate rescue operations for other officers who might respond to the scene, demonstrating professional dedication and personal courage that went far beyond normal expectations for law enforcement personnel facing impossible odds in life-threatening situations. At 10:44 a.m., the forest fell silent except for the sounds of the grizzly bear completing its predatory sequence and beginning the territorial marking behaviors that would establish the attack site as part of its hunting territory and serve as a warning to other potential intruders that this area was now under the control of a dominant predator. The entire encounter, from first visual contact to the deaths of both officers, had lasted less than 7 minutes, demonstrating the incredible efficiency and lethality of a grizzly bear operating in full predatory mode within its natural habitat. The aftermath of the attack would eventually involve multiple law enforcement agencies, wildlife management specialists, emergency medical teams, and media organizations, as the tragic event became a focal point for discussions about human-wildlife interface management, officer safety protocols in wilderness environments, and the changing behavior patterns of large predators in areas experiencing increased human activity and development pressure. Conservation Officer Lisa Hamilton received the emergency radio transmissions while en route to the officer's last known position, immediately recognizing the severity of the situation and calling for additional backup support, including helicopter evacuation capability, specialized medical teams, and armed response units equipped to deal with dangerous wildlife situations. However, the approaching storm system continued to limit aviation support options, forcing ground-based rescue teams to approach the attack site through difficult terrain under deteriorating weather conditions. The first rescue team to reach the scene, arriving at 12:47 p.m. after a grueling approach march through dense forest and increasingly severe weather conditions, consisted of 4 Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks conservation officers, 2 emergency medical technicians, and 6 volunteers from the Swan Valley Search and Rescue Organization. The team was led by Conservation Officer Hamilton, whose 15 years of experience with dangerous wildlife situations provided the expertise necessary to approach an active attack site where the predatory animal might still be present and defending its territory. Initial reconnaissance of the attack site revealed clear evidence of the predatory encounter, with extensive blood sign, scattered equipment, and physical evidence of the struggle that had taken place between the officers and the grizzly bear. However, the bodies of Sheriff Jenkins and Deputy Lopez were not immediately located, requiring extensive search operations throughout the immediate area to determine their final positions and assess the tactical situation for potential ongoing threats from the predatory animal. The discovery of Paul's body at 1:23 p.m., located approximately 50 yards from the initial attack site and partially concealed beneath fallen logs and forest debris, indicated that the bear had moved the body after completing its attack, demonstrating the kind of caching behavior typically associated with large predators securing food sources for future consumption. The condition of the remains confirmed the massive trauma inflicted during the attack and provided clear evidence that no medical intervention could have saved Paul's life, given the severity of his injuries and the remote location of the encounter. Maria's body was located 30 minutes later in a different direction from the attack site, suggesting that she had attempted to escape during the final phases of the encounter, but had been pursued and killed by the bear before she could reach safety or establish radio contact with rescue teams. The physical evidence surrounding her final position indicated that she had maintained defensive efforts until the very end, with bear spray residue, fired ammunition casings, and equipment scattered in patterns consistent with continued resistance against the predatory attack. The recovery of both bodies required careful coordination with wildlife specialists to ensure that the rescue teams did not encounter the same grizzly bear that had killed the officers, recognizing that the animals demonstrated predatory behavior and territorial dominance made it extremely dangerous to any humans entering its established hunting area. Helicopter support finally became available at 3:15 p.m. as weather conditions temporarily improved, allowing for the evacuation of the bodies and rescue personnel while minimizing ground exposure time in the dangerous environment. Dr. Elizabeth Beth Morrison, Chief Medical Examiner for Missoula County, conducted preliminary examinations of both bodies at the attack site before authorizing their removal for complete autopsy procedures that would document the full extent of injuries and provide official cause of death determinations for legal and administrative purposes. Her initial assessment confirmed that both officers had died from massive trauma consistent with grizzly bear attack, with injuries so severe that survival would have been impossible regardless of immediate medical intervention. The grizzly bear responsible for the attacks was never located despite extensive search operations involving helicopters, tracking dogs, and ground teams that continued for over 2 weeks following the incident. Wildlife specialists theorized that the bear had retreated deeper into the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex after completing its territorial establishment, potentially continuing its predatory behavior in areas even more remote from human activity and law enforcement capability. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks immediately implemented emergency closure orders for the entire Swan Valley region, prohibiting all recreational activities and restricting access to essential personnel only until the dangerous animal could be located and eliminated. However, the vast size of the wilderness area and the bear's demonstrated intelligence and stealth capabilities made successful tracking extremely difficult, particularly given the animal's apparent ability to anticipate and avoid human search efforts. The media response to the tragedy began within hours of the initial radio transmissions, as news organizations throughout Montana and the northwestern United States recognized the significance of a story involving the predatory killing of law enforcement officers by a grizzly bear exhibiting unprecedented behavioral patterns. Initial reporting focused on the basic facts of the encounter, but coverage quickly expanded to include broader discussions about wilderness safety, wildlife management policies, and the changing relationship between human activities and large predator populations. Sarah Mitchell, a veteran wildlife correspondent for the Missoulian newspaper who had covered human-bear conflicts throughout western Montana for over 12 years, provided comprehensive coverage of the incident that helped establish the factual framework for subsequent reporting by national media outlets. Her initial story, published on June 3rd, emphasized the unusual nature of the bear's behavior and the experienced background of both officers, helping readers understand that this was not a typical wildlife encounter involving inexperienced outdoor enthusiasts making basic safety mistakes. Television coverage began with local news stations in Missoula, Kalispell, and Great Falls, but quickly expanded to include regional networks throughout the Pacific Northwest and eventually national news programs that recognized the human interest appeal of the story, combined with its implications for wilderness recreation and wildlife management throughout North America. The dramatic nature of the encounter, combined with the professional backgrounds of the victims and the unprecedented behavioral patterns exhibited by the bear, created a story that captured public attention far beyond the typical coverage of wildlife-related incidents. Dr. James Patterson, the wildlife behavioral specialist who had been consulted earlier about the bear's escalating aggressive behavior, became a primary source for media interviews as reporters sought to understand the scientific and behavioral aspects of the tragedy. His expertise in grizzly bear psychology provided important context for understanding how and why a wild bear might develop the kind of sophisticated predatory behaviors that had resulted in the officers' deaths. What we witnessed in Swan Valley represents a fundamental breakdown in normal grizzly bear behavior patterns, Dr. Patterson explained during a televised interview on June 4th. This animal had progressed beyond food conditioning, beyond territorial defense, beyond any of the typical factors that lead to human-bear conflicts. It had developed sophisticated hunting strategies specifically designed to target human beings, demonstrating cognitive abilities and tactical thinking that challenges our basic understanding of bear intelligence and behavior. The psychological impact of the tragedy extended far beyond the immediate Swan Valley community, affecting law enforcement personnel throughout Montana and the northwestern United States, who recognized that the incident represented a new category of threat that existing training and protocols were inadequate to address. Many officers who regularly patrolled wilderness areas began questioning their own vulnerability and seeking additional training or equipment to prepare for similar encounters. Sheriff's departments throughout the region implemented immediate policy changes regarding wilderness patrol procedures, requiring paired officer deployment for all backcountry investigations and mandating enhanced communication protocols to ensure that officers operating in remote areas maintained regular contact with dispatch and backup support. The tragedy served as a catalyst for re-evaluating officer safety procedures in wilderness environments throughout the western United States. The families of both Sheriff Jenkins and Deputy Lopez became the focus of extensive community support efforts as residents of western Montana recognized the heroic nature of their final actions and the professional dedication they had demonstrated throughout their careers. Paul's wife, Margaret Maggie Jenkins, a retired elementary school teacher who had been married to Paul for 27 years, became a spokesperson for improved officer safety measures and increased funding for wilderness law enforcement training programs. Maria's parents, Roberto and Carmen Lopez, traveled from Tucson to attend memorial services and coordinate with Montana authorities regarding their daughter's final arrangements, expressing their pride in her professional achievements and dedication to public service while struggling to understand the random nature of the tragedy that had ended her promising career. Their presence at community memorial events helped focus attention on Maria's accomplishments and the positive impact she had made during her relatively brief time with the Missoula County Sheriff's Department. Memorial services for both officers drew attendees from throughout Montana and neighboring states, as law enforcement personnel, community members, and elected officials gathered to honor their sacrifice and express support for their families. The services provided an opportunity for the broader community to process the emotional impact of the tragedy while celebrating the professional accomplishments and personal qualities that had made both Paul and Maria respected members of the law enforcement community. Governor Margaret "Maggie" Thompson of Montana issued an official statement recognizing the heroic actions of both officers and announcing the establishment of a memorial fund to support enhanced wilderness training for law enforcement personnel throughout the state. Her statement emphasized the importance of learning from the tragedy to prevent similar incidents, while honoring the memory of 2 officers who had died in the line of duty while protecting public safety. The investigation into the circumstances surrounding the attack involved multiple agencies working to understand the sequence of events, the bears' behavioral patterns, and any factors that might have contributed to the unusual development of predatory behavior in a wild grizzly. Federal wildlife investigators from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service joined Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks personnel in conducting a comprehensive review of all available evidence, including witness reports, physical evidence from the attack site, and historical data about bear populations and behavior patterns in the Swan Valley region. Preliminary findings from the investigation confirmed that the bear responsible for the attacks had exhibited behavioral patterns unlike anything documented in previous studies of human-bear conflicts, suggesting either a unique individual with exceptional intelligence and adaptability or possibly environmental factors that had triggered unprecedented behavioral changes in local bear populations. The investigation's conclusions would have significant implications for wildlife management policies and wilderness safety protocols throughout North America. Advanced forensic analysis of physical evidence from the attack site, including DNA samples, hair samples, and detailed measurements of track patterns, confirmed that all incidents in Swan Valley had involved the same individual bear, a mature male grizzly estimated to be between 12 and 18 years old, 15 years old, with a weight approaching 900 pounds and physical characteristics indicating exceptional size and strength, even by grizzly standards. The forensic evidence also confirmed that this bear had been responsible for several additional property damage incidents that had not been previously connected to the same animal. Ballistic analysis of Sheriff Jenkins' rifle confirmed that both shots had struck the bear and should have inflicted fatal wounds under normal circumstances, raising questions about the animal's incredible resilience and determination that allowed it to continue attacking despite severe internal injuries that would have immediately incapacitated most animals. The ballistic evidence suggested that the bear's survival and continued aggressive behavior represented an extreme example of adrenaline-fueled performance that exceeded normal physiological capabilities. The failure of multiple defensive measures, including rifle fire, bear spray, and noise deterrents, to stop or even significantly slow the bear's attack, highlighted the inadequacy of current wildlife encounter protocols when dealing with predatory behavior rather than typical defensive or territorial aggression. The incident prompted immediate re-evaluation of recommended defensive strategies for law enforcement and civilian personnel who might encounter similar situations in wilderness environments. Environmental factors that might have contributed to the bear's unusual behavior became a focus of the ongoing investigation, with researchers examining everything from food source availability and territorial pressure to possible exposure to environmental toxins or diseases that might have affected normal behavioral patterns. However, preliminary analysis of these factors failed to identify any obvious explanations for the dramatic behavioral changes exhibited by the predatory animal. The broader implications of the Swan Valley tragedy extended to wilderness recreation management throughout the northwestern United States, as park services and forest management agencies re-evaluated their policies regarding public access to areas with significant bear populations. The incident demonstrated that traditional assumptions about bear behavior and human-wildlife coexistence might be inadequate for protecting public safety in an era of increasing human activity in wilderness areas. Legal proceedings related to the incident focused primarily on administrative and insurance matters related to the officers' deaths in the line of duty, but also included broader questions about liability and responsibility for wilderness safety management. The complex jurisdictional issues involved in wilderness law enforcement created additional complications for legal proceedings, requiring coordination between county, state, and federal authorities with overlapping responsibilities for public safety and wildlife management. Family members of both officers pursued legal action against various government agencies, arguing that inadequate training, equipment, and support had contributed to the tragedy and seeking compensation for their losses while advocating for improved safety measures for future wilderness law enforcement operations. These legal proceedings helped maintain public attention on the incident, while providing a mechanism for addressing systemic issues that might prevent similar tragedies. The long-term psychological impact of the Swan Valley bear attacks affected not only family members and colleagues of the deceased officers, but also the broader law enforcement community throughout Montana and neighboring states. Many officers reported increased anxiety about wilderness patrol assignments and requested additional training or equipment to help them feel more prepared for similar encounters with dangerous wildlife. Counseling services were made available to all personnel who had worked with Sheriff Jenkins and Deputy Lopez, recognizing that the traumatic nature of their deaths and the circumstances of their final radio transmissions had created significant emotional stress for colleagues who had been unable to provide assistance during the attack. The availability of professional psychological support helped department personnel process their grief while maintaining their ability to continue serving their communities effectively. Training programs developed in response to the incident emphasized the importance of recognizing predatory behavior patterns in large wildlife, understanding the limitations of available defensive measures, and maintaining communication protocols that could provide early warning of developing dangerous situations. However, many training specialists acknowledged that no amount of preparation could completely eliminate the risks associated with law enforcement operations in wilderness areas with significant predator populations. The media's ongoing coverage of the Swan Valley incident helped maintain public awareness of wilderness safety issues while contributing to broader discussions about the appropriate balance between human activities and wildlife conservation in areas of overlapping interest. However, some critics argued that sensationalized reporting of the incident created unnecessary fear of wildlife encounters and might lead to inappropriate policy responses that could harm conservation efforts. Research initiatives launched in response to the tragedy included comprehensive studies of bear behavior patterns, evaluation of defensive technologies and strategies, and analysis of environmental factors that might contribute to the development of predatory behavior in wild animals. These research efforts represented significant investments in scientific understanding that could help prevent similar incidents while advancing knowledge about human-wildlife interactions in wilderness environments. The Swan Valley bear attack of June 2, 2025 ultimately became a watershed moment in the history of wilderness law enforcement and wildlife management, serving as a catalyst for fundamental changes in training, equipment, policies, and procedures designed to protect both law enforcement personnel and civilians who work or recreate in areas with significant predator populations. The sacrifice of Sheriff Paul Jenkins and Deputy Maria Lopez provided the foundation for improvements that would benefit countless others who followed in their footsteps, ensuring that their deaths contributed to enhanced safety and professional development for future generations of wilderness law enforcement officers. The memory of their heroic final actions, their dedication to public service, and their willingness to risk their lives protecting others continues to inspire law enforcement personnel throughout the northwestern United States, serving as a reminder of the courage and professionalism required for effective service in some of America's most challenging and dangerous environments. Their legacy lives on through the enhanced training, improved equipment, and stronger safety protocols that emerged from the comprehensive analysis of the circumstances that led to their deaths, helping ensure that future officers would be better prepared to face similar challenges while serving their communities with the same dedication and courage that Paul and Maria demonstrated during their final moments in the wilderness of Swan Valley, Montana. The next stories. Grizzly Malls, 19-year-old student jogger, September 10, 2025. The morning air carried the crisp promise of autumn across the Rattlesnake National Recreation Area, just 13 miles northeast of Missoula, Montana. At 6:47 a.m. on September 10, 2025, the temperature hovered at a cool 42 degrees Fahrenheit, with visibility extending for miles across the ponderosa pine and Douglas fir canopy that blanketed the mountainous terrain. The Rattlesnake Creek Trail, a popular hiking and jogging route that wound through dense forest and open meadows, was typically busy with early morning fitness enthusiasts and dog walkers, but on this particular Tuesday, the trails would witness an event that would forever change the lives of everyone involved and send shockwaves through the University of Montana community. Brian Michael Lewis, a 19-year-old sophomore studying environmental science at the University of Montana, had been running these trails for over 14 months, ever since he'd transferred from his hometown community college in Billings. Standing 5 feet 11 inches tall, with a lean runner's build, Brian weighed approximately 168 pounds and maintained the disciplined fitness regimen that had earned him a spot on his high school cross-country team. His sandy brown hair was always kept short for practicality, and his green eyes reflected the same determination that had driven him to maintain a 3.7 GPA while working part-time at a local outdoor gear shop. Brian lived in a cramped studio apartment on the south side of Missoula with his girlfriend of 8 months, Jessica Marie Hartwell, a 20-year-old psychology major from Great Falls. Jessica had grown increasingly worried about Brian's solo morning runs, especially as September brought reports of increased grizzly bear activity in the area surrounding Missoula. The Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Department had issued multiple advisories throughout the late summer, warning outdoor enthusiasts that bears were actively foraging in preparation for winter hibernation, making them more aggressive and unpredictable in their behavior. Despite Jessica's concerns and repeated attempts to convince Brian to run with a partner or choose more populated routes, he insisted that his morning solitude on the Rattlesnake Trail was essential to his mental health and academic performance. The previous evening, September 9th, Brian and Jessica had argued about his running routine during dinner at their favorite pizza place, Biga Pizza on North Higgins. Jessica, a petite brunette with worried brown eyes and a tendency to research every possible danger that might befall those she loved, had printed out 3 articles about recent bear encounters in western Montana, including a July incident where a mountain biker had been chased for nearly half a mile by an aggressive black bear just 40 miles south of their location. Brian, however, remained steadfast in his belief that his knowledge of bear safety protocols and his consistent use of the same familiar route made his morning runs relatively low-risk activities. "You're being paranoid, Jess," Brian had said, reaching across the small wooden table to squeeze her hand. "I've been running those trails for over a year. I know every turn, every creek crossing, every steep section. I carry bear spray, I make noise when visibility is limited, and I stick to the main trail. Besides, most bear encounters happen to people who are hiking quietly or surprise bears at close range. I'm running, so I'm naturally making noise and moving fast." Jessica had sighed, her fingers nervously tearing at the paper napkin in her lap. But the reports are saying bears are more active right now, and you go so early that you're often the only person out there for miles. What if something happened and nobody found you for hours? Their argument had continued as they walked back to their apartment, Brian's confidence clashing with Jessica's intuitive fear. Neither of them could have imagined that within 12 hours, Jessica's worst fears would not only be realized, but would unfold in a manner far more horrific than either of them had ever contemplated. Brian's alarm pierced the pre-dawn darkness at 5:30 a.m., its shrill electronic beeping cutting through the silence of their small apartment. Jessica stirred beside him, but didn't fully wake as Brian quietly slipped out of bed and began his morning routine. He pulled on his favorite running outfit, black, moisture-wicking shorts, a bright orange long-sleeved technical shirt that Jessica had bought him specifically for visibility, and his well-worn Salomon Trail running shoes that had carried him over hundreds of miles of Montana terrain. In the bathroom, he splashed cold water on his face and brushed his teeth, studying his reflection in the mirror and noting that he looked tired from the previous night's argument and late study session. By 6:15 a.m., Brian was ready to leave. He grabbed his small hydration pack, into which he'd loaded a 16-ounce water bottle, his cell phone wrapped in a waterproof case, a small first aid kit, and his canister of counter-assault bear spray, a maximum-strength deterrent that sprayed 30 feet and contained a 2% capsaicin formula. As he quietly opened the apartment door, he glanced back at Jessica's sleeping form and felt a pang of guilt about their argument. He made a mental note to apologize properly when he returned, and perhaps suggest a compromise where she could join him on weekend runs. The drive from their apartment to the Rattlesnake Trailhead took exactly 18 minutes through the quiet streets of early morning Missoula. Brian's 2018 Honda Civic hummed quietly as he navigated the familiar route, passing the sleeping houses and dark storefronts of a city not yet awakened. He parked in the small gravel lot at the trailhead, noting that his was the only vehicle present, a detail that would later prove crucial to investigators trying to establish a timeline of events. The parking area, surrounded by tall ponderosa pines and marked by a large wooden sign detailing trail information and bear safety guidelines, was illuminated only by Brian's headlights and the faint glow of approaching dawn. At exactly 6:43 a.m., according to the timestamp on the last photo Brian took with his phone, he began his run. The image showed the familiar wooden trail marker indicating the start of the Rattlesnake Creek Trail, with the first hints of sunrise creating a golden glow through the forest canopy. This photograph would later become a key piece of evidence in the investigation, marking the precise moment Brian began what would be his final run. The Rattlesnake Creek Trail stretched for over 10 miles through diverse terrain, beginning with a gentle incline through mixed conifer forest before climbing more steeply toward alpine meadows and eventually connecting to the Continental Divide Trail system. Brian's typical morning route covered approximately 6 miles out and back, taking him to a scenic overlook about 3 miles from the trailhead, where he would usually pause to catch his breath and enjoy the view of the Missoula Valley spread out below. The trail was well maintained by the Forest Service, with clear markers every half-mile and wooden bridges crossing the creek at several points. As Brian settled into his running rhythm, his breathing synchronized with the steady thud of his footsteps on the packed dirt trail, he felt the familiar peace that had drawn him to these solitary morning runs. The forest around him was beginning to wake up, with bird songs filtering down through the canopy and the gentle sound of Rattlesnake Creek providing a constant audio backdrop. The air smelled of pine needles, damp earth, and the faint scent of early morning mist that rose from the creek. Brian's pace was comfortable and sustainable, around 7.5 minutes per mile, allowing him to maintain awareness of his surroundings while still pushing himself physically. Unknown to Brian, He was not alone in the forest that morning. Approximately 1¼ miles ahead on the trail, a massive grizzly bear was engaged in the crucial pre-hibernation activity of foraging for food. The bear, later identified by wildlife officials as a male weighing an estimated 640 pounds and standing nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, had wandered down from higher elevations following the scent of ripening service berries and the salmon runs in nearby streams. Grizzly bears, known scientifically as Ursus arctos horribilis, can weigh up to 800 pounds and possess incredible strength, capable of reaching speeds of up to 35 miles per hour and possessing a bite force of over 1,200 pounds per square inch. This particular bear, designated as bear number 47 in the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks database, had been previously captured and fitted with a GPS collar during a 2023 research study. The collar data would later reveal that the bear had traveled over 15 miles in the previous 48 hours, covering territory from the Mission Mountains to the east down into the Rattlesnake drainage. Wildlife biologists would later describe this movement pattern as typical for a large male grizzly in autumn, as they search for high-calorie food sources to build the fat reserves necessary for surviving winter hibernation. The bear's presence in the area hadn't gone completely unnoticed. Dale Morrison, a 63-year-old retired Forest Service employee who lived in a cabin approximately 2 miles from the trailhead, had reported seeing bear scat and torn-up logs along a side trail just 3 days earlier. Dale had dutifully reported his observation to the local Fish, Wildlife and Parks office, but with dozens of similar reports coming in from across western Montana during the peak of berry season, no specific action had been taken beyond adding the information to their general database of bear activity. Margaret Chen, a wildlife biologist with 15 years of experience studying grizzly behavior, would later review bear number 47's collar data and movement patterns. This bear was displaying classic pre-hibernation foraging behavior, she would explain to investigators. Large male grizzlies like this one need to consume up to 20,000 calories per day in the fall to build sufficient fat reserves. They become single-minded in their search for food and can become extremely aggressive if they perceive any threat to a food source or if they're surprised at close range. As Brian continued his run, climbing steadily through the forest at a pace that would have him reaching his turnaround point in approximately 23 minutes, he followed his usual safety protocols. Every few hundred yards, especially when approaching blind corners or areas of dense vegetation, he would call out, "Hey, bear," in a loud, clear voice. This practice, recommended by all wildlife agencies, is designed to alert bears to human presence and give them the opportunity to leave the area rather than be surprised by an unexpected encounter. The trail at this point wound through particularly dense forest, with huckleberry bushes and mountain ash creating thick understory vegetation on both sides of the narrow path. Towering ponderosa pines and Douglas firs created a canopy that filtered the early morning light into scattered patches of gold and green. The terrain here was moderately steep, with a series of switchbacks that climbed steadily toward higher elevations. Rattlesnake Creek, swollen with late summer runoff, rushed loudly through a rocky gorge approximately 50 feet to the left of the trail. At 7:02 a.m., Brian rounded a sharp left turn in the trail and entered a small clearing where serviceberry bushes, heavy with ripe purple fruit, lined both sides of the path. The clearing, roughly 30 yards long and 15 yards wide, had been created by a small avalanche several years earlier and was now filled with the low-growing berry bushes that bears found irresistible. Brian had passed through this spot dozens of times during his morning runs and had always admired the way the early morning light filtered through the surrounding trees into the open space. What Brian couldn't see as he approached the clearing at his steady running pace was that bear number 47 had been feeding in the serviceberry patch for approximately 25 minutes. The massive grizzly had discovered this concentrated food source during his early morning foraging and had already consumed several pounds of the high-sugar berries. Bears are notorious for their poor eyesight, but possess extraordinarily acute hearing and sense of smell. The sound of the rushing creek, combined with his intense focus on feeding, had masked the sound of Brian's approaching footsteps and periodic bear calls. The collision between human and bear occurred at exactly 7:03 a.m., according to Brian's fitness tracker, which recorded the precise moment his heart rate spiked from 135 beats per minute to over 180 beats per minute in less than 2 seconds. Brian rounded the final bend before the clearing and found himself face to face with the enormous grizzly bear at a distance of less than 25 feet. For a split second that seemed to last an eternity, both human and bear froze in mutual surprise. Brian's training and knowledge of bear safety procedures flooded through his mind as he tried to process the massive creature standing before him. The bear, startled from his intensive feeding, rose up on his hind legs to get a better look at this unexpected intruder. Standing upright, the grizzly towered nearly 7 feet tall, his massive shoulders and arms covered in thick brown fur that caught the morning light. His small, dark eyes fixed on Brian with an intensity that sent an immediate signal of danger. Brian's first instinct was correct according to bear safety guidelines. He slowly began to back away while speaking in a calm, steady voice. "Easy, bear. I'm leaving. I'm not a threat." He avoided direct eye contact, which bears interpret as aggressive behavior, and resisted every instinct that told him to turn and run. Running from a grizzly bear, as Brian well knew, would trigger the animal's chase instinct and result in certain death, as even the fastest human runner cannot outpace a bear over any distance. For approximately 15 seconds, the standoff continued. Brian continued his slow, backward movement while maintaining his calm, verbal communication. The bear dropped back down to all fours, but remained alert and agitated, his massive head swinging back and forth as he tested the air with his sensitive nose. Brian's hand moved slowly toward his bear spray, which was attached to the shoulder strap of his hydration pack for quick access. The critical moment came when Brian's backward movement caused him to step on a dry branch that cracked loudly under his weight. The sharp sound triggered an immediate change in the bear's behavior. What wildlife experts later identified as a defensive attack response caused the grizzly to lower his head, lay his ears back flat against his skull, and emit a series of huffing and jaw-popping sounds that indicated extreme agitation and preparation for aggressive action. Brian managed to draw his bear spray and remove the safety clip just as the grizzly began his charge. A 640-pound grizzly bear can accelerate from standing still to 30 miles per hour in less than 3 seconds, covering the 25 feet between them in approximately 2 seconds. Brian had barely enough time to raise the canister and depress the trigger before the massive animal was upon him. The bear spray discharged in a wide orange cloud that caught both Brian and the attacking bear. The 2% capsaicin formula, designed to temporarily disable an attacking bear's ability to see and breathe, had an immediate effect on the grizzly, but not enough to stop his momentum. The bear crashed into Brian with the force of a small automobile, sending him flying backward off the trail and into the thick serviceberry bushes. Brian's 168-pound frame was no match for the bear's massive bulk and strength. The initial impact broke 3 of his ribs and dislocated his left shoulder as he crashed into the undergrowth. The bear, partially blinded and enraged by the chemical spray, followed Brian into the bushes and began what wildlife experts would later classify as a predatory attack rather than a defensive one. This distinction would prove crucial to the subsequent investigation and policy changes that followed. The attack itself lasted approximately 4.5 minutes, according to data from Brian's fitness tracker, which continued recording his heart rate and GPS coordinates throughout the ordeal. During these critical minutes, the bear inflicted massive trauma to Brian's body using his powerful jaws and 4-inch claws. Grizzly bears possess a bite force of over 1,200 pounds per square inch, easily capable of crushing bones, and their claws are designed for digging and can penetrate deeply into flesh and organs. Brian's screams echoed through the forest as he fought desperately to protect his vital areas, using techniques he had learned from bear safety courses and wilderness first aid training. He attempted to play dead by lying face down and covering his neck with his hands, but the bear's aggressive behavior indicated this was a predatory rather than defensive attack, making passive resistance ineffective. The bear's initial focus was on Brian's back and shoulders, where his claws opened deep lacerations through his technical running shirt and into the muscle and tissue beneath. The orange fabric, saturated with bear spray residue, seemed to further agitate the animal. Brian's attempts to crawl away only seemed to increase the bear's aggressive behavior as the animal grabbed him by the leg and began dragging him deeper into the serviceberry thicket, away from the main trail. During the attack, Brian managed to activate the emergency SOS function on his GPS watch, which sent an automated distress signal to emergency services along with his precise coordinates. This signal, transmitted at 7:04:33 a.m., would prove to be the factor that saved his life by alerting rescue personnel to his exact location within minutes of the attack. The grizzly's attention turned to Brian's head and neck area as the young man's movements became increasingly weak and uncoordinated from blood loss and shock. The bear's massive jaws closed around Brian's left shoulder and upper arm, puncturing through skin, muscle, and into bone. Brian's screams became weaker as his body went into traumatic shock, his blood pressure dropping dangerously low as significant blood loss began to shut down non-essential body systems. At 7:07:47 a.m., according to his fitness tracker, Brian's heart rate began to stabilize at a dangerously low 55 beats per minute, indicating severe trauma and the onset of hypovolemic shock. His GPS coordinates showed that the bear had dragged him approximately 43 yards from the main trail into dense undergrowth, where he would have been nearly impossible to locate without the precise positioning data from his emergency beacon. The attack might have continued until Brian's death, but at 7:08:15 a.m., the bear suddenly stopped his assault and raised his massive head to test the air. The sound of approaching voices and the unfamiliar scent of other humans had penetrated his rage-induced tunnel vision. Two early morning hikers, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a 45-year-old emergency room physician from Missoula, and her hiking partner, James Rodriguez, a 38-year-old paramedic with the Missoula County EMS system, were approaching the clearing from the opposite direction on their regular Tuesday morning hike. Dr. Mitchell and James had started their hike from a different trailhead approximately 4 miles away and were making their way toward the same scenic overlook that Brian had been running toward. Both were experienced wilderness enthusiasts who had completed advanced wilderness first aid training and carried comprehensive medical supplies during their backcountry adventures. They had been hiking for approximately 90 minutes when they heard Brian's screams echoing through the forest. "That's definitely human," Dr. Mitchell had said immediately, her medical training allowing her to distinguish between human distress calls and animal sounds. James had nodded grimly, and both had quickened their pace, while calling out loudly to announce their presence to any wildlife in the area. Both carried bear spray and had encountered black bears on previous hikes. though neither had ever faced a grizzly bear encounter. As they approached the clearing where the attack was taking place, the bear's acute hearing detected their voices and approaching footsteps. The massive grizzly, still partially affected by the bear spray but beginning to recover, looked up from Brian's motionless form and focused his attention on this new potential threat. Wildlife behaviorists would later explain that bears often abandon an attack when confronted with additional humans, as their instinct is to avoid confrontation with multiple opponents. The bear released his grip on Brian's shoulder and stood to his full height, testing the air and listening carefully to determine the location and number of approaching humans. After several tense seconds, during which Brian lay unconscious and bleeding heavily in the serviceberry bushes, the grizzly made the decision to retreat. He moved quickly but deliberately away from the attack site, crashing through the undergrowth in a direction that would take him up the steep hillside and away from both the approaching hikers and the main trail system. Dr. Mitchell and James entered the clearing at exactly 7:09 a.m., just 68 seconds after the bear had abandoned his attack. The scene that greeted them was one that would haunt both medical professionals for the rest of their careers. Brian's bright orange running shirt was shredded and soaked with blood, and his body lay twisted unnaturally among the destroyed serviceberry bushes approximately 40 yards from the main trail. "Jesus Christ," James whispered, immediately recognizing the severity of the situation as both he and Dr. Mitchell rushed toward Brian's location. The strong scent of bear spray still hung in the air, and fresh bear tracks and scat were clearly visible throughout the disturbed vegetation. Both rescuers were acutely aware that the bear might still be in the immediate area and could return at any moment. Dr. Mitchell reached Brian first and immediately began her primary assessment, while James established radio contact with emergency services. Brian was unconscious but breathing, though his respirations were shallow and rapid at 32 breaths per minute. His pulse was weak and thready at 58 beats per minute, and his skin was pale and cool to the touch, indicating significant blood loss and the progression of hypovolemic shock. "This is James Rodriguez, Missoula County Paramedic Badge number 247. James spoke into his emergency radio. "We have a critical grizzly bear attack victim at coordinates." He read off the GPS coordinates from his own device, which closely matched the emergency beacon signal that Brian's watch had transmitted. "We need immediate helicopter evacuation, advanced life support, and armed fish and wildlife personnel. The bear was present less than 2 minutes ago and may still be in the immediate area." While James coordinated the emergency response, Dr. Mitchell worked frantically to stabilize Brian's condition using the medical supplies from both of their hiking packs. Her initial assessment revealed devastating injuries that would require immediate surgical intervention if Brian was to survive. The bear's claws had opened deep lacerations across his back, shoulders, and arms that had severed multiple muscles and damaged nerves. His left shoulder showed obvious signs of massive crushing trauma from the bear's jaws, with bone fragments visible through the torn tissue. "Severe crush injuries to the left shoulder and arm," Dr. Mitchell called out as she worked, automatically providing a medical assessment for James to relay to incoming emergency personnel. "Multiple deep lacerations with significant muscle and nerve damage. Possible internal injuries. Patient is in severe hypovolemic shock with weak pulse and dropping blood pressure. We need blood products and surgical intervention immediately." Brian's most critical injury was the damage to his left subclavian artery, a major blood vessel that supplies the arm and shoulder. The bear's jaws had crushed this artery, causing massive internal bleeding that was rapidly becoming life-threatening. Dr. Mitchell applied direct pressure to the wound, while James set up an IV line using supplies from their emergency kit. Both medical professionals were acutely aware that they were fighting against time in a race to keep Brian alive until more advanced medical care could arrive. The emergency response that followed Brian's SOS signal was immediate and comprehensive, involving multiple agencies and dozens of personnel. The Missoula County Emergency Communications Center received Brian's automated distress signal at 7:04:33 a.m. and immediately began coordinating response efforts. Within 3 minutes, Missoula County Sheriff's deputies, Missoula Fire Department rescue personnel, and Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks officers were all en route to the trailhead. Alert Air Medical Services, the helicopter emergency medical service that covers western Montana, received the call at 7:07 a.m. and immediately began pre-flight preparations for their Bell 429 helicopter, equipped with advanced life support capabilities. The flight crew, consisting of pilot Captain Rebecca Torres, flight nurse Patricia Williams, and paramedic Michael Chen, had responded to bear attack emergencies before, but knew that grizzly attacks presented unique challenges due to the severity of injuries and the typically remote locations where they occurred. Meanwhile, at the trailhead parking area, the first ground-based responders were arriving and beginning the challenging process of reaching Brian's location. Missoula County Sheriff's Deputy Mark Stevens, a 15-year veteran with extensive wilderness rescue experience, arrived at 7:11 a.m. and immediately began organizing the ground response. He was quickly joined by Fire Captain David Walsh and 3 additional firefighters equipped with advanced medical equipment and wilderness rescue gear. "We're looking at approximately a 3-mile hike to reach the victim," Deputy Stevens briefed the arriving personnel. "The terrain is moderate to steep with several creek crossings. We have confirmed bear activity in the immediate area of the victim, so we'll need armed wildlife officers as part of the response team. ETA to the victim location is approximately 45 minutes on foot. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Warden." Lisa Henderson arrived at the trailhead at 7:15 a.m., equipped with a high-powered rifle and extensive experience in dealing with dangerous wildlife encounters. Warden Henderson had been involved in 3 previous grizzly bear attack investigations and understood the critical importance of securing the scene while ensuring the safety of rescue personnel. She would lead the approach to Brian's location while the medical personnel focused on patient care. The helicopter evacuation presented its own challenges due to the dense forest canopy and steep terrain surrounding Brian's location. Captain Torres conducted an aerial reconnaissance of the area and identified a small clearing approximately 200 yards from the attack site that could serve as a landing zone. However, the clearing required preparation by ground personnel to remove debris and ensure safe helicopter operations in the confined space. Back at the attack site, Dr. Mitchell and James continued their life-saving efforts while maintaining constant vigilance for the bear's potential return. Brian's condition had stabilized somewhat with the IV fluids, but he remained unconscious and required continuous monitoring. The emergency medical supplies they carried were designed for typical hiking emergencies, such as broken bones, hypothermia, or minor lacerations, not the massive trauma inflicted by a 600-pound grizzly bear. "His blood pressure is still dropping," Dr. Mitchell reported, as she checked Brian's vital signs every few minutes. "We're losing the battle with the internal bleeding." "How far out is the helicopter?" James checked his radio and received an update from the incoming flight crew. "Alert 1 is airborne and approximately 8 minutes from our location. Ground crews are preparing the landing zone now. We need to be ready to move him as soon as they touch down." The sound of approaching voices echoed through the forest as the ground-based rescue team made their way up the trail. Warden Henderson led the group with her rifle ready, followed closely by the medical personnel carrying advanced life support equipment. The team moved as quickly as safety would allow, knowing that every minute delayed increased the risk to Brian's survival and the possibility of another bear encounter. At 7:23 a.m., Warden Henderson entered the clearing where the attack had occurred and immediately began assessing the scene for signs of continued bear activity. The massive paw prints, disturbed vegetation, and strong scent markers left little doubt about the size and species of bear involved. She established a security perimeter around the medical personnel, while Fire Captain Walsh and his team took over Brian's care from Dr. Mitchell and James. This was definitely a large male grizzly, Warden Henderson reported via radio to the Fish, Wildlife and Parks headquarters. Based on track size and gait measurements, I estimate 600 pounds plus. The attack pattern suggests predatory behavior rather than defensive. The bear dragged the victim approximately 40 yards from the main trail into thick cover. Captain Walsh's assessment of Brian's injuries confirmed Dr. Mitchell's initial evaluation. The young man had lost a significant amount of blood and showed signs of severe crush injuries to his left shoulder and arm. His vital signs remained unstable despite intravenous fluid resuscitation, indicating ongoing internal bleeding that would require immediate surgical intervention. The decision was made to proceed with helicopter evacuation as soon as the aircraft could safely land. The alert helicopter arrived at 7:26 a.m., with Captain Torres skillfully maneuvering the aircraft into the prepared clearing despite challenging wind conditions and the confined landing space. Flight nurse Patricia Williams and paramedic Michael Chen immediately joined the ground medical team while maintaining radio contact with the trauma surgeons at St. Patrick Hospital in Missoula, the designated Level 2 trauma center that would receive Brian for definitive care. The helicopter crew brought advanced medical equipment including blood products, advanced airway management tools, and medications that could help stabilize Brian's condition during the flight to the hospital. Patricia Williams, a 15-year flight nursing veteran who had treated dozens of trauma patients, immediately recognized the severity of Brian's injuries and the critical nature of his condition. "This is a load-and-go situation," she announced to the assembled medical team. "We need to get him to the trauma center immediately. His injuries are beyond what we can manage in the field." The team worked together to carefully package Brian for transport, immobilizing his spine and securing his airway while preparing him for the helicopter flight that would take approximately 12 minutes to reach the hospital. At 7:31 a.m., exactly 28 minutes after the bear attack began, Brian was loaded aboard the alert helicopter for emergency transport to St. Patrick Hospital. Dr. Mitchell and James, exhausted from their life-saving efforts, watched the aircraft disappear over the forest canopy, carrying the young man whose life they had helped preserve. Both would later be recognized for their heroic actions, but at that moment they felt only the profound relief of knowing they had given Brian his best possible chance for survival. The helicopter flight to St. Patrick Hospital was a race against time as Brian's condition continued to deteriorate despite aggressive medical intervention. Flight nurse Williams maintained continuous monitoring of his vital signs while administering blood products to combat the massive blood loss. His blood pressure remained dangerously low at 85/45 millimeters of mercury, and his heart rate had climbed to 145 beats per minute as his body struggled to compensate for the ongoing internal bleeding. "Missoula Trauma, this is Alert 1. Patricia Williams spoke into her headset, communicating directly with the trauma team that was preparing to receive Brian. ETA 4 minutes with a 19-year-old male, victim of grizzly bear attack. Multiple severe lacerations, crush injuries to left shoulder and arm, significant blood loss with ongoing internal bleeding. Patient is unconscious, blood pressure 85/45, heart rate 145, receiving O-negative blood and normal saline. Appears to have arterial damage with possible subclavian artery involvement. Dr. Amanda Richardson, the chief trauma surgeon at St. Patrick Hospital, listened to the radio report while scrubbing in for what she knew would be a challenging and complex surgical case. Dr. Richardson had 22 years of trauma surgery experience, including several previous bear attack cases, but grizzly attacks presented unique surgical challenges due to the massive crushing forces involved and the deep tissue penetration of the animal's claws and teeth. The trauma team at St. Patrick Hospital had been alerted to the incoming patient at 7:15 a.m. and had been using the time to prepare the trauma bay and operating room for what they anticipated would be a critical case requiring multiple specialties. In addition to Dr. Richardson, the team included orthopedic surgeon Dr. James Kim, vascular surgeon Dr. Maria Santos, and anesthesiologist Dr. Robert Chang, along with a full complement of trauma nurses and surgical technicians. Alert 1 touched down on the hospital helipad at 7:43 a.m., exactly 12 minutes after departing from the forest clearing. Brian was immediately transferred to a waiting gurney and rushed into the trauma bay, where the medical team began their comprehensive assessment and stabilization efforts. His condition had continued to deteriorate during the flight, with his blood pressure dropping further to 78/42 millimeters of mercury and his heart rate climbing to 155 beats per minute. "What's our blood type and cross-match status?" Dr. Richardson asked as the team began their initial trauma assessment. Brian's wallet, recovered from his hydration pack at the scene, had provided identification, and the hospital had been able to access his medical records from previous visits. He had no known allergies, and his blood type was O positive, which allowed for immediate transfusion of compatible blood products. The trauma team's initial assessment confirmed the severity of Brian's injuries and the critical nature of his condition. In addition to the obvious external wounds, imaging studies revealed internal injuries including a punctured lung, several broken ribs, and most critically, a severed subclavian artery that was causing massive internal bleeding into his chest cavity. His left shoulder showed extensive crush damage with multiple fractures and possible nerve damage that would require orthopedic reconstruction. "We need to get him to OR stat," Dr. Richardson announced after completing her assessment. "He's bleeding into his chest, and we're losing the battle with fluid resuscitation. How's our blood bank status?" The hospital's blood bank had been notified of the incoming trauma patient and had prepared multiple units of O-positive blood along with fresh frozen plasma and platelets that would be needed during the complex surgical procedures. At 8:15 a.m., Brian was taken into operating room 3 for what would become a 6.5-hour surgical marathon involving multiple procedures to save his life and preserve as much function as possible in his severely damaged left arm and shoulder. Dr. Santos, the vascular surgeon, led the initial procedure to repair the severed subclavian artery and stop the life-threatening internal bleeding that had brought Brian close to death. The arterial repair was technically challenging due to the extensive tissue damage surrounding the blood vessel and the contamination from bear saliva and debris that had been driven into the wound during the attack. Dr. Santos worked meticulously to clean the wound, remove damaged tissue, and reconstruct the artery using a segment of vein harvested from Brian's leg. This procedure alone took nearly 2 hours and required the transfusion of 6 units of blood to replace what had been lost during the attack and continued bleeding. While Dr. Santos worked on the vascular injuries, Dr. Kim prepared for the complex orthopedic reconstruction that would be needed to repair Brian's shattered shoulder and upper arm. The bear's jaws had crushed the head of his humerus and fractured his shoulder blade in multiple places, requiring the insertion of metal plates, screws, and pins to stabilize the bones and provide a framework for healing. The extensive muscle and nerve damage meant that full recovery of function was uncertain, even with optimal surgical repair. Dr. Richardson coordinated the overall surgical effort while managing Brian's other injuries, including the repair of his punctured lung and the cleaning and closure of dozens of claw marks that covered his back, shoulders, and arms. Each wound required careful cleaning to remove dirt, plant matter, and bacterial contamination that could lead to serious infection if not properly treated. Bear attacks are notorious for causing severe infections due to the bacteria present in the animals' mouths and the deep penetration of claws that carry surface contaminants into tissue. The anesthesia management during the prolonged surgery was particularly challenging due to Brian's significant blood loss and traumatic shock. Dr. Chang worked continuously to maintain Brian's blood pressure and oxygenation while the surgical team worked to repair the extensive damage. The young man's vital signs remained unstable throughout the procedure, requiring constant adjustment of medications and continued blood product transfusion. News of the grizzly bear attack began spreading through the University of Montana campus and the broader Missoula community within hours of the emergency response. Jessica Hartwell, Brian's girlfriend, was notified by campus police at 8:45 a.m. and immediately rushed to St. Patrick Hospital, where she was met by victim services coordinators and hospital social workers who helped her navigate the crisis and provided support during the agonizing wait for news about Brian's condition. Jessica's phone had been ringing continuously since news of the attack became public, with calls from Brian's family in Billings, mutual friends from the university, and even reporters from local news outlets who had learned of the incident from emergency scanner traffic. She had managed to reach Brian's parents, Robert and Linda Lewis, who immediately began the 3-hour drive from Billings to Missoula to be with their son during his critical hospitalization. The media response to the grizzly bear attack was immediate and intense, with local television stations and newspapers sending reporters to both the hospital and the attack site to cover what was being described as the most serious bear attack in western Montana in over 5 years. The story quickly gained regional and national attention as details of Brian's injuries and the dramatic rescue effort became known. KPX TV reporter Jennifer Walsh arrived at St. Patrick Hospital at 9:30 a.m. and began interviewing witnesses and hospital staff about the attack and Brian's condition. Her initial report, which aired during the noon news broadcast, described the incident as a terrifying encounter between a University of Montana student and a massive grizzly bear that left the young man fighting for his life. The attack also prompted immediate response from Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks officials, who launched a comprehensive investigation into the incident and began efforts to locate and evaluate the bear responsible for the attack. Warden Henderson, who had secured the attack scene, was joined by additional wildlife officers and bear specialists who began the process of tracking the animal and determining whether it posed a continued threat to public safety. Bear specialist Dr. Frank Mueller, who had studied grizzly behavior in Montana for over 20 years, arrived at the attack site at 10:15 a.m. to begin his assessment of the incident. Dr. Mueller's initial examination of the physical evidence confirmed that this had been a large male grizzly bear and that the attack pattern suggested predatory rather than defensive behavior, which raised serious concerns about public safety in the area. This was not a typical defensive encounter where a bear was surprised and reacted to protect cubs or a food source, Dr. Mueller explained to the assembled media representatives. The evidence suggests this bear actively pursued and attacked the victim, which is characteristic of predatory behavior. This makes the bear extremely dangerous and requires immediate action to locate and evaluate the animal. The search for bear number 47 began immediately, using both ground-based tracking teams and helicopter surveillance to cover the vast area where the animal might have traveled following the attack. The bear's GPS collar had continued transmitting location data, showing that he had moved approximately 2 miles northeast of the attack site into even more remote wilderness areas. Wildlife officers established a safety perimeter around the attack site and posted warning signs alerting other trail users to the danger. As news of the attack spread throughout the day, the Rattlesnake Trail system was closed to public access, pending the completion of the bear investigation and removal of the dangerous animal. This closure affected dozens of daily users, including hikers, trail runners, mountain bikers and dog walkers, who regularly use the popular recreation area. Local outdoor recreation businesses also reported immediate impacts as customers cancelled planned activities in the area. The University of Montana issued a campus-wide alert about the attack involving one of their students and provided counseling resources for students and staff who were affected by the news. Brian's environmental science professors and classmates organized vigils and fundraising efforts to support his medical expenses and recovery, while the university's outdoor recreation programs reviewed their safety protocols for students participating in wilderness activities. Brian's surgery continued throughout the afternoon, with the complex orthopedic reconstruction proving even more challenging than initially anticipated. Dr. Kim worked meticulously to rebuild the shattered bones in Brian's shoulder and upper arm, using titanium plates and screws to create a framework that would allow the bones to heal properly. The extensive muscle and nerve damage meant that multiple procedures would likely be needed over the coming months to optimize his recovery. At 2:47 p.m., Dr. Richardson emerged from the operating room to provide Brian's family with an update on his condition. Robert and Linda Lewis, along with Jessica and several close friends, had been waiting anxiously in the surgical waiting room for over 6 hours since Brian's arrival at the hospital. The stress and fear of potentially losing their son had taken a visible toll on both parents, who had driven from Billings in a state of shock and disbelief. "The surgery is going well, but we're not out of the woods yet," Dr. Richardson explained to the gathered family members. "We've successfully repaired the damaged artery and stopped the internal bleeding, which was the most immediate threat to Brian's life. However, the orthopedic injuries are extensive and will require ongoing reconstruction over several procedures. We're cautiously optimistic about his survival, but full recovery will be a long process." Linda Lewis, a 51-year-old elementary school teacher, broke down in tears of relief upon hearing that her son had survived the most critical phase of his injuries. Robert Lewis, a construction foreman who had spent his career in physically demanding work, struggled to comprehend how a simple morning run could have resulted in such devastating injuries to his athletic and capable son. "Will he be able to use his arm normally?" Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as he contemplated the potential long-term impacts of the attack on Brian's future. Dr. Richardson's response was honest but cautiously hopeful, explaining that while significant nerve and muscle damage had occurred, modern surgical techniques and rehabilitation therapy offered good prospects for meaningful recovery of function. The surgical team continued working through the afternoon, with Dr. Kim completing the orthopedic reconstruction by 4:30 p.m. and Dr. Richardson finishing the wound cleaning and closure procedures by 5:15 p.m. Brian was then transferred to the surgical intensive care unit, where he would remain unconscious and on mechanical ventilation while his body began the critical early stages of healing from the massive trauma. The evening news coverage of the grizzly bear attack dominated local media, with detailed reports on Brian's condition, the rescue operation, and the ongoing search for the dangerous bear. Television stations aired dramatic helicopter footage of the attack site and interviews with wildlife experts about grizzly behavior and safety precautions for outdoor enthusiasts. The story quickly gained national attention, with major networks picking up the dramatic rescue story and providing updates on Brian's condition. Dr. Mitchell and James Rodriguez, the hikers who had discovered Brian and provided initial life-saving medical care, were interviewed by multiple news outlets about their heroic actions. Both credited their medical training and wilderness experience with allowing them to stabilize Brian's condition until professional emergency responders could arrive, but both also emphasized the random nature of the encounter and the importance of proper bear safety precautions. "We just happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right training," Dr. Mitchell told KPAX-TV reporter Jennifer Walsh. "If we had been 10 minutes later, or if Brian hadn't had his emergency GPS beacon, this could have had a very different outcome. People need to understand that bears are wild animals, and encounters like this, while rare, are always a possibility when we're in their habitat." The search for bear number 47 intensified on September 11th, with additional personnel and resources deployed to locate the dangerous animal. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks officials made the decision to classify the bear as a threat to public safety based on the predatory nature of the attack and the need to prevent additional encounters. This classification authorized the use of lethal control methods if the bear could not be safely captured and relocated. Wildlife tracking teams followed the bear's GPS collar signal into increasingly remote terrain, using both ground-based tracking and helicopter surveillance to monitor the animal's movements. The collar data showed that bear number 47 had traveled over 8 miles from the attack site in the 24 hours following the incident, moving through rugged mountain terrain that made ground-based pursuit extremely difficult. Bear specialist Dr. Mueller coordinated the tracking effort while analyzing the behavioral patterns that had led to the attack. His preliminary assessment suggested that the bear's recent movements and feeding behavior indicated an animal that was highly stressed and potentially exhibiting abnormal aggression levels. Blood samples collected from the attack site would later be tested to determine if the bear was suffering from any diseases or conditions that might have influenced his behavior. Brian remained in critical condition throughout his first night in the intensive care unit, with medical staff monitoring his vital signs continuously and adjusting his treatment based on his body's response to the massive trauma. His blood pressure had stabilized following the surgical repair of his damaged artery, but his overall condition remained tenuous due to the extensive injuries and the risk of complications such as infection or organ failure. Jessica maintained a constant vigil at Brian's bedside, holding his hand and speaking to him, despite the fact that he remained unconscious and on mechanical ventilation. The hospital's victim services coordinators had arranged for her to stay in a nearby family housing unit, and Brian's parents had checked into a local hotel to be close to the hospital during their son's critical recovery period. The emotional impact of the attack extended far beyond Brian's immediate family and friends. The University of Montana community, particularly students and faculty in the environmental science program, struggled to come to terms with the reality that one of their own had become the victim of such a violent encounter with the wilderness that many of them studied and loved. Counseling services reported increased demand as students processed their fears about outdoor activities and the risks inherent in Montana's wild spaces. Local outdoor recreation businesses began receiving cancellations and inquiries about bear safety as news of the attack spread throughout the region. Sporting goods stores reported increased sales of bear spray and emergency communication devices as people sought to better protect themselves during wilderness activities. The attack had served as a stark reminder that despite Montana's reputation for outdoor recreation, the state's wild spaces contained genuine dangers that required constant vigilance and proper precautions. On September 12th, 48 hours after the attack, wildlife officers finally located bear number 47 using helicopter surveillance and GPS collar tracking. The massive grizzly was found feeding on an elk carcass approximately 12 miles northeast of the attack site, displaying behavior that appeared normal for a bear preparing for winter hibernation. The decision was made to attempt capture and relocation rather than immediate lethal control, based on the possibility that the attack had been an isolated incident triggered by specific circumstances. The capture operation required extensive planning and coordination between multiple agencies, as attempting to tranquilize and transport a 600-pound grizzly bear in remote mountain terrain presented significant logistical challenges. Wildlife biologists prepared specialized tranquilizer equipment, while helicopter crews planned the complex aerial operation that would be needed to safely capture and relocate the dangerous animal. Dr. Chen, the wildlife biologist who had been studying bear number 47 through the GPS collar research project, provided crucial insights into the animal's behavior patterns and likely responses to capture attempts. Her data showed that this particular bear had never displayed aggressive behavior toward humans in previous encounters, making the attack on Brian an anomaly that suggested either illness, extreme stress, or unusual circumstances that had triggered the predatory response. At St. Patrick Hospital, Brian's condition began showing signs of gradual improvement as his body responded to the intensive medical treatment and his vital signs stabilized. Dr. Richardson was cautiously optimistic about his progress, noting that his blood pressure had returned to near normal levels and his body was beginning to fight off the infection risk that always accompanied such severe wounds. "The next 72 hours will be critical," Dr. Richardson explained to Brian's family during her daily update meeting. "His body has been through tremendous trauma, and we need to watch carefully for signs of complications such as infection or organ system failure. However, his youth and overall fitness level are working in his favor, and we're seeing positive signs in his recovery." Physical therapy consultations began even while Brian remained unconscious, with specialists assessing the extent of nerve and muscle damage in his left arm and shoulder to begin planning the long-term rehabilitation program that would be necessary for optimal recovery. The extent of the orthopedic injuries meant that Brian would likely require multiple additional surgeries and months of intensive physical therapy to regain meaningful function in his left arm. The media attention surrounding the attack continued to intensify, with national news outlets sending reporters to Missoula to cover the story and interview experts about grizzly bear behavior and safety. The dramatic nature of the rescue and the young victims' fight for survival captured public attention across the country, with social media campaigns emerging to support Brian's recovery and raise funds for his medical expenses. Campus security at the University of Montana increased patrols around outdoor recreation areas and issued additional safety bulletins reminding students about proper precautions for wilderness activities. The attack had heightened awareness of the risks that outdoor enthusiasts faced in Montana's bear country and prompted renewed discussions about balancing recreation access with wildlife conservation and public safety concerns. On September 13th, the capture operation for bear number 47 began at dawn with a coordinated effort involving helicopter crews, wildlife biologists, and veterinarians equipped to safely tranquilize and transport the massive animal. The operation took place in rugged terrain, approximately 15 miles from the nearest road, requiring precise helicopter maneuvering to position tranquilizer teams within effective range of the bear. Dr. Mueller led the capture team, using a helicopter-mounted tranquilizer system to deliver a carefully calculated dose of immobilizing drugs to the 640-pound grizzly. The tranquilization process was complicated by the bear's size and the need to deliver an effective dose without causing harm to the animal or creating dangerous situations for the capture team. The tranquilizer dart struck bear number 47 successfully at 7:23 a.m., and the massive animal was fully immobilized within 12 minutes. The capture team immediately began the complex process of examining the bear for signs of disease or injury that might have contributed to the aggressive behavior, while preparing the animal for transport to a wildlife facility where more comprehensive evaluation could be conducted. Veterinary examination of the captured bear revealed no obvious signs of disease or injury that would explain the predatory attack on Brian. The animal appeared to be in excellent health with normal body weight and condition for a male grizzly preparing for hibernation. Blood samples were collected for laboratory analysis to rule out rabies or other neurological conditions that might have affected the bear's behavior. The decision was made to relocate bear number 47 to a remote area of Glacier National Park, approximately 150 miles from the attack site, where the animal could complete his pre-hibernation feeding and enter winter denning without posing a continued threat to recreationists in the Missoula area. The relocation would be conducted using specialized wildlife transport equipment designed to safely move large predators over long distances. Back at the hospital, Brian began showing signs of returning consciousness on his third day in intensive care. His eyelids fluttered in response to voices, and he showed reflexive movements in his uninjured right arm when medical staff performed routine examinations. These positive neurological signs indicated that his brain had not suffered significant damage from the blood loss and shock he had experienced during the attack. Dr. Chang, the anesthesiologist who had managed Brian's care during the marathon surgery, began the process of gradually reducing sedation medications to allow Brian to regain consciousness while managing his pain levels with appropriate analgesics. The process required careful monitoring to ensure that Brian's awakening did not cause dangerous increases in blood pressure or heart rate that could compromise his healing. Jessica was present when Brian first opened his eyes at 2:15 p.m. on September 13th, exactly 79 hours after the bear attack. His first words, spoken in a hoarse whisper through his breathing tube, were, Did I make it?" The relief and joy on Jessica's face as she squeezed his uninjured right hand and assured him that he was safe brought tears to the eyes of the nursing staff who had been caring for him around the clock. Brian's parents, who had maintained their vigil at the hospital since arriving from Billings, were overwhelmed with emotion as their son showed clear signs of neurological recovery. Linda Lewis later described this moment as the most beautiful sound I had ever heard, as Brian whispered their names and demonstrated that his memory and cognitive functions appeared to be intact despite the severe trauma he had endured. The medical team's assessment of Brian's neurological recovery was extremely positive, indicating that his brain had suffered no apparent long-term damage from the blood loss and shock associated with the bear attack. However, the physical recovery process would be extensive, with months of rehabilitation therapy needed to regain function in his severely damaged left arm and shoulder. Dr. Kim, the orthopedic surgeon who had reconstructed Brian's shattered shoulder, explained to the family that while the surgical repair had been successful in stabilizing the bones and providing a framework for healing, the extensive muscle and nerve damage meant that full recovery would require dedication to an intensive rehabilitation program. The young man's age and previous fitness level were significant advantages in the recovery process. Physical therapy evaluations began immediately after Brian regained consciousness, with specialists assessing his range of motion, muscle function, and nerve sensation in both arms to establish baseline measurements for his rehabilitation program. The evaluation revealed significant weakness and numbness in his left arm, confirming the extensive nerve damage that had been anticipated based on the nature of his injuries. The emotional and psychological impact of the attack became apparent as Brian began processing what had happened to him during his morning run. Hospital psychologists and trauma counselors began working with him to address the post-traumatic stress symptoms that commonly develop following such violent encounters with wildlife. Brian reported vivid flashbacks of the attack and expressed anxiety about ever being outdoors alone again. News of Brian's improving condition was met with celebration throughout the University of Montana campus and the broader Missoula community. Students and faculty organized fundraising events to help cover his medical expenses and support his recovery, while local businesses donated goods and services to assist Brian's family during their extended stay in Missoula for his treatment. The successful capture and relocation of bear number 47 was announced by Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks on September 14th, providing some closure to the community and allowing for the gradual reopening of the Rattlesnake Trail system. However, the attack had prompted a comprehensive review of bear safety protocols and public education programs designed to prevent similar incidents in the future. Wildlife officials used the incident as an opportunity to educate the public about proper bear safety precautions, including the importance of making noise while hiking, carrying bear spray, traveling in groups when possible, and avoiding known bear activity areas during peak feeding times. The attack on Brian, while rare, served as a stark reminder that grizzly bears are powerful predators that require respect and caution from anyone venturing into their habitat. Brian's recovery continued steadily over the following weeks, with gradual improvements in his strength and mobility as his body healed from the extensive surgical repairs. However, the rehabilitation process proved to be more challenging than anticipated, with nerve damage in his left arm resulting in significant weakness and limited range of motion that required intensive physical and occupational therapy. The financial impact of Brian's medical care was substantial, with initial hospital and surgical costs exceeding $200,000 and ongoing rehabilitation therapy adding additional expenses that would continue for many months. The University of Montana's student insurance provided some coverage, but the specialized nature of his injuries and the extended recovery period created financial hardships for his family. Community support for Brian's recovery grew throughout September and into October, with fundraising campaigns organized by his classmates, local businesses, and outdoor recreation groups who were deeply affected by the attack. The campaigns raised over $85,000 to help cover medical expenses and provide financial support for Brian's family during his recovery period. Legal consultation began in October as Brian's family considered potential liability issues related to the attack and the adequacy of warning systems in place on the Rattlesnake Trail. While bear attacks in wilderness areas typically do not result in successful liability claims due to the assumption of risk inherent in outdoor recreation, the family wanted to explore all options for recovering the substantial medical costs associated with Brian's treatment and rehabilitation. The psychological impact of the attack proved to be as challenging as the physical injuries, with Brian developing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder that included severe anxiety about outdoor activities, recurring nightmares about the attack, and hypervigilance around any sounds or movements that might indicate danger. Professional counseling and trauma therapy became essential components of his overall recovery program. Dr. Patricia Wong, a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma recovery, began working with Brian in late September to address the psychological effects of his near-death experience. Dr. Wong explained that surviving such a violent encounter often results in fundamental changes in how victims perceive safety and risk, requiring extensive therapy to restore confidence and normal functioning. Brian's psychological recovery is just as important as his physical healing, Dr. Wong explained to his family. Survivors of predator attacks often struggle with anxiety, depression, and avoidance behaviors that can significantly impact their quality of life. The goal of therapy is to help Brian process the trauma and develop coping strategies that will allow him to reclaim his life and interests. The University of Montana's Environmental Science program organized a symposium on bear safety and wildlife management in October, using Brian's attack as a case study for discussing the challenges of balancing outdoor recreation with wildlife conservation. The event featured presentations by wildlife biologists, bear safety experts, and trauma medical professionals who provided comprehensive information about preventing and responding to bear encounters. Brian's story resonated with outdoor enthusiasts across the country, many of whom saw in his experience their own worst fears about wildlife encounters. His case became a teaching tool for wilderness safety courses and bear awareness programs, helping to educate thousands of people about proper precautions and emergency response procedures that could save lives in similar situations. As winter approached, Brian's physical therapy intensified with the goal of maximizing his recovery before cold weather limited his ability to engage in outdoor rehabilitation activities. His left arm had regained some function, but significant weakness and limited range of motion persisted, indicating that full recovery would likely take many more months of dedicated therapy. The investigation into the circumstances surrounding the bear attack was completed in November, with wildlife officials concluding that the incident had been the result of an unusual combination of factors, including the bear's heightened pre-hibernation feeding behavior, Brian's unfortunate timing in entering an active feeding area, and the particular aggressiveness displayed by this specific individual bear. Bear number 47's relocation to Glacier National Park had been successful, with GPS collar data showing that the animal had established normal feeding and movement patterns in his new territory without any additional conflicts with humans. The bear had entered hibernation in late November, and wildlife biologists planned to continue monitoring his behavior when he emerged from his den in the following spring. Brian's first attempt at returning to classes at the University of Montana came in January 2026, nearly 4 months after the attack. His physical limitations required accommodations for note-taking and other activities that involved use of his left arm, while his ongoing psychological treatment helped him manage anxiety about being on campus and interacting with large groups of people. The media attention that had initially focused on Brian's attack and dramatic rescue evolved into longer-term coverage of his recovery process and the broader issues surrounding human-wildlife conflicts in Montana. His story became part of ongoing discussions about wilderness management policies and the challenges of maintaining both wildlife populations and public access to recreational areas. Physical therapy sessions continued 3 times per week throughout the winter months, with Brian working with occupational therapists to adapt to the permanent limitations in his left arm, while maximizing his functional capabilities. The nerve damage had proven more extensive than initially hoped, resulting in permanent weakness and reduced sensation that would require lifelong accommodations. Brian's relationship with Jessica deepened throughout his recovery period, as she provided unwavering support during the most challenging phases of his physical and emotional healing. Their shared experience of trauma and recovery created a bond that helped both of them process the life-changing events that had begun with a simple morning run on a beautiful September day. The financial burden of Brian's ongoing medical care and rehabilitation continued to challenge his family's resources. despite the community fundraising efforts and insurance coverage. The specialized nature of his injuries and the extended recovery timeline created costs that exceeded $350,000 by the spring of 2026, prompting additional fundraising efforts and consideration of long-term financial planning strategies. Legal proceedings related to the attack were ultimately unsuccessful, as courts determined that the risks inherent in wilderness recreation and the comprehensive warning systems already in place absolved government agencies of liability for the bear encounter. The family's attorneys had argued that inadequate warning of specific bear activity in the area constituted negligence, but existing law provided broad protections for recreational land managers. Brian's return to running came gradually and with significant modifications to his previous routine. His left arm's limited function affected his balance and coordination, requiring him to adapt his running style and choose less challenging terrain than he had previously enjoyed. The psychological barriers to returning to wilderness areas proved even more challenging than the physical limitations. His first return to the Rattlesnake Trail area didn't occur until August 2026, nearly a full year after the attack, and required months of preparation, including exposure therapy, to manage his anxiety about being in bear habitat. The experience was emotionally overwhelming, bringing back vivid memories of the attack, while also providing a sense of reclaiming his life from the trauma that had defined the previous year. The University of Montana's bear safety protocols were significantly enhanced following Brian's attack, with new requirements for wilderness activity reporting, buddy system mandates for certain high-risk activities, and expanded education programs for students participating in outdoor recreation. Brian became an advocate for these enhanced safety measures, sharing his story with incoming students to emphasize the importance of proper precautions. Wildlife management policies in the Missoula area were also modified based on lessons learned from the investigation into Brian's attack. New protocols required more intensive monitoring of individual bears, showing unusual behavior patterns, enhanced public notification systems for areas with recent bear activity, and improved coordination between multiple agencies responsible for public safety in recreational areas. Dr. Mitchell and James Rodriguez, the hikers whose quick action had saved Brian's life, remained in contact with him throughout his recovery and became close family friends. Both credited the experience with reinforcing their commitment to wilderness medicine and emergency preparedness, and both became instructors in wilderness first aid programs that used Brian's case as a teaching example. The long-term impact of the grizzly bear attack on Brian Lewis extended far beyond his personal recovery to influence wildlife management policies, wilderness safety education, and community awareness of human-wildlife conflicts throughout Montana and the broader Rocky Mountain region. His survival and recovery became a testament to the importance of emergency preparedness, rapid medical response, and the dedication of both professional rescuers and ordinary citizens who rise to extraordinary circumstances. As Brian entered his senior year at the University of Montana in the fall of 2026, his experience had fundamentally changed his career goals and life perspective. His environmental science studies took on new meaning as he focused on human-wildlife conflict resolution and wilderness safety education, fields where his personal experience provided unique insights and credibility that would serve him throughout his professional career. The physical scars from the grizzly bear attack remained visible reminders of that September morning when a routine run became a life-changing encounter with one of North America's most powerful predators. However, Brian's determination to overcome both the physical limitations and psychological trauma of his experience demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit and the possibility of not just surviving, but thriving after experiencing nature's most violent expressions. His story continues to serve as both a cautionary tale about the risks inherent in wilderness recreation and an inspiring example of recovery and resilience in the face of overwhelming trauma. The grizzly bear attack on September 10, 2025, lasted less than 5 minutes, but its impact on Brian Lewis, his family, his community, and wildlife management practices would continue for decades to come, ensuring that his experience would help protect future generations of outdoor enthusiasts from similar encounters with the magnificent but dangerous predators that share Montana's wild spaces. The next stories. The Stalking Shadow. The morning mist clung to the valleys of Glacier National Park like ghostly fingers, and David Reynolds felt the familiar thrill of anticipation coursing through his veins as he shouldered his pack. At 29, he was an experienced hiker with over a decade of backcountry adventures under his belt, but this trip was different, special. His wife of 3 weeks, Sarah Martinez Reynolds, adjusted her own pack beside him, her dark eyes bright with excitement despite the early hour. "Ready for our real honeymoon adventure?" David asked, his breath visible in the crisp July air. Their actual honeymoon had been a brief weekend in Seattle, all they could afford after the wedding expenses. But this week-long backpacking trip through some of Montana's most remote wilderness was their true celebration. Sarah nodded, her long black hair already pulled back in the practical ponytail she wore for hiking. At 27, she was newer to serious backpacking than David, but her background as a rock climbing instructor had given her excellent outdoor instincts and physical conditioning. "I still can't believe we have this whole week," she said, consulting the detailed topographic map one more time. "Just us and the mountains." The couple had spent months planning this route through the park's backcountry, carefully selecting a path that would take them through some of the most spectacular and isolated terrain in the lower 48. Their planned route would cover roughly 60 miles over 7 days, beginning at the Polebridge entrance and winding through dense forests, alpine meadows, and along pristine mountain lakes. David's best friend Marcus Chen had driven them to the trailhead at dawn, his beat-up Ford pickup truck loaded with their carefully organized gear. Marcus, 31, worked as an emergency room nurse in Kalispell and had been David's hiking partner for years before Sarah entered the picture. He understood the mountain's dangers better than most, having treated numerous backcountry injuries and even a few bear attack victims over his 8-year career. "You've got the satellite communicator, right?" Marcus asked for the 3rd time as they unloaded gear in the pre-dawn darkness. His concern wasn't unfounded. This particular area of Glacier had seen increased grizzly activity over the past month, something the park rangers had mentioned during their backcountry permit briefing. "Yes, Mom," David replied with good-natured sarcasm, patting the device clipped to his pack's shoulder strap. The Garmin InReach Mini would be their lifeline to the outside world, capable of sending text messages and GPS coordinates via satellite from anywhere in the wilderness. And the bear spray, and the bear canisters, and the emergency medical kit that Sarah insisted on upgrading. Sarah had indeed insisted on carrying a more comprehensive first aid kit than David typically brought. Her background working for a wilderness therapy program had taught her that medical emergencies in remote locations could turn deadly quickly. The extra weight was worth the peace of mind, especially on such an extended trip into grizzly country. Park Ranger Janet Martinez, no relation to Sarah despite the shared surname, had briefed them thoroughly during their permit pickup 2 days earlier. A 20-year veteran of the National Park Service with an expertise in human-wildlife interactions, she'd emphasized the critical importance of proper food storage and maintaining awareness in an ecosystem where grizzly bears were not just present, but actively denning and foraging. "We've had 3 separate grizzly encounters along portions of your planned route in the past 6 weeks, Ranger Martinez had explained, spreading detailed maps across her desk in the backcountry office. "Nothing aggressive, but definite sightings. A sow with 2 cubs was photographed near Quartz Lake just last Tuesday, and we found fresh digging sign along the Bowman Lake Trail system. The ranger had marked each location on David and Sarah's map with red ink, noting dates and times of the encounters. Her weathered hands, scarred from decades of outdoor work, traced their planned route with the careful attention of someone who'd seen what could go wrong when people underestimated the wilderness. "I'm not trying to scare you off," she'd continued, her grey eyes serious. "But I want you to understand that you're entering an active bear habitat during peak foraging season. These animals are intelligent, powerful, and unpredictable. Your safety depends entirely on following proper protocols." David had hiking experience in grizzly country, but Sarah was less familiar with the specific behaviors and precautions required. They'd spent several evenings studying bear behavior, practicing with their bear spray, and drilling the procedures for bear encounters. Sarah had initially been nervous about the grizzly presence, but David's confidence and their thorough preparation had helped ease her concerns. The weather forecast looked perfect for their departure day. Clear skies, temperatures ranging from 42 degrees at dawn to a high of 73, with minimal wind. Perfect conditions for covering their planned 12-mile first day to their campsite at Quartz Lake. But weather in the Montana mountains could change rapidly, and both David and Sarah carried full rain gear and layers suitable for temperature drops of 30 degrees or more. As Marcus drove away, his taillights disappearing around a bend in the access road, David and Sarah stood alone at the trailhead in the growing light. The forest around them was beginning to wake. The distant call of a loon across Bowman Lake, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth, and the eternal whisper of wind through ancient pines. "Last chance to change your mind about room service and hot showers?" David joked. But his eyes were already fixed on the trail ahead, with unmistakable longing. "Not a chance," Sarah replied, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Despite her relative inexperience with extended backcountry travel, she'd fallen in love with the profound peace that came from being truly disconnected from civilization. "Let's go find our wilderness." The first few miles of trail wound gently through old-growth forest, following the shoreline of Bowman Lake. Ancient cedars and Douglas firs towered overhead, their canopy filtering the morning sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. The trail was well maintained here, wide enough for the couple to walk side by side when terrain permitted. Sarah found her rhythm quickly, her rock-climbing background serving her well on the occasional scrambles over fallen logs and rocky sections. David set a comfortable pace, checking his GPS periodically, but mostly navigating by the familiar landmarks he'd studied on the topographic maps. By 9 a.m., they'd covered 4 miles and stopped for their first break at a scenic overlook. The view stretched across Bowman Lake to the Continental Divide peaks beyond, their snow-covered summits gleaming in the morning sun. Sarah pulled out her camera, an expensive DSLR that was one of their few wedding splurges, and began capturing the breathtaking scenery. "I can't believe places like this actually exist," she murmured, adjusting her telephoto lens to frame a distant waterfall cascading down granite cliffs. David was studying their map, calculating their progress and the terrain ahead. The next section of trail would be more challenging, climbing steadily through dense forest before opening into the alpine basin where Quartz Lake waited. He estimated they'd reach their planned campsite by mid-afternoon, giving them plenty of time to set up camp and explore the area. "How are your feet feeling?" he asked. Blisters and hot spots could ruin a backcountry trip faster than almost anything else, and this was the longest hike Sarah had ever attempted. "Good so far," she replied, wiggling her toes in her well-broken-in boots. "Those conditioning hikes we did really helped." They'd spent 2 months preparing for this trip, gradually building up to longer and more challenging day hikes. Sarah had initially struggled with the weight of a full pack, but her strength and endurance had improved remarkably. David was proud of how seriously she'd taken the preparation, understanding that her safety, their safety, depended on being physically and mentally ready for the challenges ahead. As they resumed hiking, the trail began to climb more steeply. The forest around them grew denser, with thick undergrowth that limited visibility beyond a few dozen yards in most directions. This was prime habitat for wildlife of all kinds, from deer and elk to mountain lions and bears. David found himself scanning the terrain ahead more frequently, looking for signs of recent animal activity. At a creek crossing around mile 6, Sarah pointed out fresh tracks in the mud along the water's edge. "Are those bear prints?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of excitement rather than fear. David knelt to examine the tracks more closely. They were definitely ursine, showing the characteristic claw marks extending well beyond the toe prints. Based on the size, nearly 6 inches long, they belonged to either a large black bear or a grizzly. The depth of the impressions suggested a heavy animal, and the freshness of the sign indicated the bear had passed through within the last day or two. "Grizzly, I think," David said, pulling out his phone to photograph the tracks. "Probably an adult, maybe even a big male based on the size." Rather than being alarmed, both David and Sarah felt a thrill at this evidence that they were truly in wild country. They were well prepared for bear encounters, carrying 2 canisters of bear spray and following all the recommended precautions for food storage and campsite selection. The afternoon sun was beginning to angle lower through the trees when they finally reached the shore of Quartz Lake. The pristine alpine lake stretched nearly a mile across, its surface mirror calm and reflecting the surrounding peaks with crystalline clarity. Their planned campsite was located on a small peninsula jutting into the lake's eastern shore, providing spectacular views while maintaining the 100-yard distance from water sources required by park regulations. Sarah dropped her pack with a sigh of relief and satisfaction. Her legs were tired, but she felt strong and accomplished. "This is absolutely perfect," she said, turning in a slow circle to take in the 360-degree view of wilderness surrounding them. David was already evaluating potential tent sites, looking for level ground that would be comfortable, while also considering factors like wind exposure, drainage, and proximity to food storage requirements. His years of backcountry experience had taught him that a good night's sleep started with smart campsite selection. "What do you think about right there?" he asked, pointing to a flat area about 50 yards back from the lake shore. "Good drainage, protected from wind, and far enough from the water to meet regulations." Sarah approved, and they began the familiar routine of setting up their temporary home. Their 4-season tent went up quickly, with the practiced efficiency that came from multiple training sessions in David's backyard. The lightweight but sturdy shelter would be their protection against weather and wildlife for the next 6 nights. Next came the critical task of organizing their food and scented items. Everything edible, along with toiletries, soap, and even toothpaste, had to be stored in the park-provided bear canisters. These hard-sided containers were designed to be impossible for even the most persistent and intelligent grizzly to open, but they had to be positioned at least 100 yards from the campsite and preferably downhill. David and Sarah walked the perimeter of their area, looking for the ideal bear canister location. They found a suitable spot about 120 yards northwest of their tent, in a small clearing, where the containers would be easily visible but safely distant from their sleeping area. "I still can't believe how much thought goes into this," Sarah observed as they positioned the 2 cylindrical containers. "At home, you just throw food in the refrigerator." "That's what keeps us safe out here," David replied, testing to make sure the canisters were secure. "Bears are incredibly intelligent. If we give them any opportunity to associate humans with food, it puts everyone at risk." With camp established and their food properly stored, The couple had several hours of daylight remaining to explore their surroundings. Sarah was eager to photograph the lake from various angles, while David wanted to scout the area and identify potential wildlife viewing opportunities. They decided to hike the shoreline trail that curved around the lake's northern edge. The path was fainter here, more of a game trail than an official hiking route, but it provided access to some spectacular viewpoints and hidden coves. About a mile from their campsite, they discovered a natural amphitheater where a small stream cascaded into the lake over a series of granite ledges. The area was lush with wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, mountain aster, and bear grass, creating a vibrant tapestry of color against the gray stone. Sarah was in photographer's heaven, capturing the interplay of water, stone, and flowers from dozens of angles. David found a comfortable boulder and settled in to watch her work, enjoying the intense concentration and joy she brought to her art. "This is going to be our Christmas card," Sarah announced, showing him the camera's LCD screen. The image showed the waterfall perfectly framed by wildflowers, with snow-capped peaks reflected in the lake's calm surface. As the afternoon wore on, they began to notice more signs of wildlife activity. Fresh deer tracks along the muddy shoreline, the distant call of a piloted woodpecker echoing across the water, and what might have been elk droppings on the trail back toward camp. "I keep expecting to see something big," Sarah said as they walked back toward their campsite. "All these tracks and signs, but the animals are invisible." "They see us long before we see them," David explained. "Most wildlife avoids humans instinctively. We're too loud, too smelly, too different from anything natural in their world." But even as he said it, David couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was nothing concrete, just an intuitive sense that had served him well during years of backcountry travel. The forest felt too quiet, the usual bird calls and small animal sounds noticeably absent. Back at camp, they began preparing dinner as the sun angled lower toward the western peaks. Their carefully planned meal system relied on lightweight, high-calorie foods that could be prepared with minimal cooking. Tonight's dinner was a freeze-dried pasta primavera that would be rehydrated with boiling water from their efficient canister stove. While David worked on dinner preparation, Sarah organized their gear for the night. Everything not essential for evening activities went into the tent. While items they might need during the night, headlamps, bear spray, first aid kit, remained easily accessible. The temperature was beginning to drop with the approaching sunset, and both put on insulating layers. Even in July, mountain nights could be surprisingly cold, especially at their elevation of over 5,000 feet. Dinner was simple but satisfying, eaten while sitting on a fallen log that provided a perfect view across the lake. They talked quietly about their plans for the following day, which would take them over a high mountain pass and down into the next valley system. "I'm a little nervous about the pass," Sarah admitted. "That's the highest elevation I've ever hiked to." The pass they would cross tomorrow topped out at just over 7,000 feet, requiring a climb of nearly 2,000 feet from their current location. It would be the most challenging day of their entire trip, but also potentially the most rewarding in terms of scenic views. "We'll take it slow," David assured her. "Plenty of rest stops, and if the weather looks threatening, we can always turn back." As darkness settled over the lake, they cleaned their dishes thoroughly and stored everything in the bear canisters. The evening routine was methodical and careful. Any food residue or scented items left accessible could attract unwanted visitors during the night. By 9 p.m., full darkness had settled over their remote campsite. The stars emerging overhead were brilliant in the absence of light pollution, the Milky Way clearly visible as a glowing river across the sky. Sarah had never seen the night sky so clearly. Growing up in suburban Denver, where city lights washed out all but the brightest stars. "I could just lie here and stare up all night," she murmured, her head pillowed on David's shoulder as they lay on their sleeping pads outside the tent. "Wait until we get above tree line tomorrow," David replied. "The stars at altitude are even more incredible." They eventually retreated into their tent as the temperature continued to drop. Their combined sleeping bags and insulating pads created a warm, comfortable cocoon against the mountain cold. Sarah fell asleep quickly, exhausted by the physical challenges and emotional intensity of their first day in the wilderness. David lay awake longer, listening to the subtle night sounds of the forest around them, an owl calling from across the lake, the gentle lapping of small waves against the shore, and the distant howl of what might have been a wolf or coyote far up the valley. But underneath these natural sounds, he occasionally heard something else, a rustling in the brush that seemed too large and too deliberate to be a small animal. Probably deer, he told himself, or even an elk moving through their area. Large herbivores often moved at night, especially during the summer months when they sought cooler temperatures and relief from biting insects. Still, David kept his bear spray within easy reach as he finally drifted off to sleep. Years of backcountry experience had taught him that being prepared was always better than being sorry, especially in country where they were definitely not at the top of the food chain. The first night passed without incident, but David woke several times to sounds he couldn't quite identify. Each time, he listened carefully for several minutes before determining that whatever was moving around their campsite had moved on. By morning, he'd convinced himself that his heightened awareness was simply a normal response to sleeping in new territory. Sarah woke refreshed and excited for the day ahead. Their second day would be the most challenging of the entire trip, but also the most rewarding. The high mountain pass they planned to cross was legendary among local hikers for its spectacular panoramic views. After a quick breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, they broke down camp with the efficient routine that comes from practice. Everything had to be packed carefully. Weight distribution, accessibility of essential items, and protection from weather were all critical considerations. The morning air was crisp and clear, with unlimited visibility toward the peaks they would be climbing. Weather conditions looked perfect for their crossing, with no sign of the afternoon thunderstorms that could make high-altitude travel dangerous. They left their campsite at Quartz Lake just after 7 a.m., headlamps still necessary in the pre-dawn forest. The trail climbed immediately, switchbacking up through dense timber toward the tree line still several thousand feet above. Sarah found the early climbing challenging but manageable. Her conditioning was holding up well, and the cool morning air made the physical exertion more comfortable than it would be later in the day. By mid-morning, they'd climbed above the densest forest into more open terrain, dotted with subalpine firs and whitebark pines. The views back toward Quartz Lake were already spectacular, and they were only halfway to the pass. During a rest break at around 9,000 feet, David noticed something that made him pause. Fresh tracks in a muddy section of trail, definitely grizzly bear based on the size and claw marks, and obviously recent based on their sharp definition. "The same bear from yesterday?" Sarah asked, examining the prints. "Maybe," David replied, though something about these tracks bothered him. They seemed to be following the same route that he and Sarah were taking, almost as if the bear was deliberately traveling the human trail rather than cross-country as bears typically preferred. They continued climbing, but David found himself checking behind them more frequently. The tracks had created a nagging sense of unease that he couldn't quite shake. Bears did sometimes use established trails, especially when traveling between feeding areas, but the persistence of the sign along their exact route seemed unusual. The final approach to the pass was a steep scramble over loose rock and alpine vegetation. Sarah struggled with the thin air and steep grade, but her determination kept her moving steadily upward. David stayed close, ready to assist if she needed help with balance or route finding. Just before noon, they crested the pass and emerged onto a windswept saddle between two massive peaks. The view in every direction was breathtaking, range after range of mountains stretching to the horizon, pristine valleys filled with ancient forests and glaciated peaks that seemed to touch the sky. "Oh my God!" Sarah whispered, slowly turning to take in the 360-degree panorama. "This is the most beautiful place I've ever been." They spent over an hour at the pass, photographing the views and simply absorbing the profound silence and majesty of the high country. David identified various peaks and valleys using his topographic map, planning future adventures in the wilderness spread out below them. But even in this moment of triumph and beauty, he couldn't completely shake his growing unease about the bear sign they'd been seeing. Something about the pattern bothered him, though he couldn't articulate exactly what was wrong. The descent on the far side of the pass was steep and technical, requiring careful attention to foot placement on loose rock. Sarah handled it well, using her climbing experience to maintain balance and control. By mid-afternoon, they'd descended back into forest and were looking for a suitable campsite near a small alpine lake marked on their map. Their second campsite was even more spectacular than the first, a small meadow beside a jewel-like tarn, surrounded by towering peaks and completely isolated from any sign of human presence. They were now deep in the backcountry, at least 15 miles from the nearest road and completely dependent on their own resources. As they set up camp, David continued to notice small signs that bothered him. Broken branches at about the height a large bear might reach, fresh digging in a nearby meadow, and that same feeling of being watched that had troubled him the night before. "I'm probably just being paranoid," he told himself, but years of wilderness experience had taught him to trust his instincts. Something about their situation felt different, though he couldn't identify what was triggering his concern. That evening, as they prepared dinner and organized their camp, David made a decision. He would sleep with the bear spray in his hand, and he would wake Sarah at the first sign of trouble. In the wilderness, being overly cautious was never a mistake, but being insufficiently alert could be fatal. Sarah noticed his heightened awareness, but attributed it to normal backcountry caution. She trusted David's experience and judgment completely, confident that his years of wilderness travel would keep them safe in any situation. As darkness settled over their remote campsite, neither could imagine that their peaceful honeymoon adventure was about to become a desperate fight for survival. Somewhere in the forest around them, a massive grizzly bear was already beginning the stalking behavior that would test every skill and instinct they possessed. The night sounds seemed different here, less familiar, more primitive and wild than anything Sarah had experienced before. She fell asleep, listening to David's steady breathing beside her, feeling safe and protected in their small shelter against the vast wilderness surrounding them. But David lay awake for hours, every sense alert for sounds that didn't belong. His hand never moved from the bear spray clipped to his sleeping bag, and his eyes frequently checked the tent's entrance for any sign of movement outside. Around 2 a.m. he heard it clearly, the unmistakable sound of a large animal moving deliberately through the forest nearby. Not the random wandering of deer or elk, but the purposeful, intelligent movement of a predator investigating their campsite. David held his breath, listening intently as the sound circled their tent at a distance of perhaps 50 yards. Whatever was out there was being careful, methodical, learning about these new arrivals in its territory. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the sounds faded as the animal moved away into the forest. David remained alert until dawn, but the mysterious visitor didn't return. In the morning, he found tracks that confirmed his worst fears. A massive grizzly bear had indeed circled their campsite, investigating their tent, their bear canisters, and even the spot where they'd cooked dinner the night before. The tracks told a story that chilled David's blood. This wasn't a random encounter with a bear passing through the area. The pattern of movement, the deliberate investigation, and the repeated circling suggested something far more dangerous, a bear that was actively interested in them specifically. Sarah noticed his tension immediately when he returned from examining the tracks. "What's wrong?" she asked, though his expression already told her the answer. "We had a visitor last night," David said quietly. "A big grizzly. It spent considerable time checking us out." The implications hit Sarah immediately. A bear that showed this level of interest in humans was potentially extremely dangerous. Their careful food storage and camp cleanliness should have prevented any association between humans and food, but something had clearly attracted this animal's attention. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. David was already studying their map, calculating distances and options. They were currently 2 days' hike from their exit point, but there was a shorter route that could get them out in a day and a half if they pushed hard. "We need to seriously consider cutting the trip short," he said. "This kind of behavior isn't normal and it could escalate." Sarah felt a stab of disappointment. They'd planned this trip for months, and the wilderness was even more beautiful than they'd imagined. But her trust in David's judgment was absolute, and the fear in his voice was unmistakable. "If you think we should go, then we go," she said simply. But even as they began breaking down camp with unusual haste, both sensed they were being watched. The forest around them felt charged with tension, as if some invisible presence was monitoring their every move. The feeling of being stalked by an intelligent predator was unlike anything either had ever experienced. It transformed their beautiful wilderness sanctuary into a threatening maze where danger could emerge from any direction without warning. David clipped his bear spray to his pack's chest strap and insisted that Sarah do the same. From now on, they would both carry their deterrent spray in immediately accessible positions, ready for instant deployment. As they left their second campsite and began hiking toward what they hoped was safety, neither realized that their ordeal was just beginning. The massive grizzly that had investigated their camp was unlike any bear they could have prepared for, an apex predator with the intelligence and persistence to turn their honeymoon adventure into the most terrifying experience of their lives. The morning sun that had seemed so beautiful just days earlier now felt ominous, casting deep shadows in the forest where anything could be hiding. Every rustling branch, every snapping twig, every bird call that suddenly stopped could signal the approach of 800 pounds of muscle, claws, and predatory intelligence. Sarah stayed close behind David as they hiked, her eyes constantly scanning the forest around them. The camera that had been her constant companion now remained packed away. Photography seemed frivolous when survival might depend on maintaining constant vigilance. David set a faster pace than they'd maintained on previous days, driven by an urgency he couldn't fully explain, but didn't dare ignore. His wilderness experience had taught him that when something felt wrong in bear country, the smart response was immediate evacuation. But as they climbed toward another high pass that would take them closer to civilization and safety, both began to realize that their stalker was still with them. Broken branches, disturbed vegetation, and that persistent feeling of being watched all suggested that the grizzly was shadowing their movement. The hunter had become the hunted, and their peaceful honeymoon hike had transformed into a deadly game of survival where the rules were written by one of nature's most efficient predators. David and Sarah were about to discover just how inadequate their human preparations were against a grizzly bear that had decided they were worth following. The next 24 hours would test every skill, every instinct, and every ounce of courage they possessed. In the vast wilderness of Glacier National Park, they were about to learn that sometimes the most beautiful places on Earth can also be the most dangerous. Their love, their partnership, and their very survival would depend on making the right decisions in the face of a threat that human beings were never meant to face alone. The grizzly bear stalking them through the Montana wilderness was about to teach them lessons about fear, courage, and the thin line between civilization and the raw power of nature. As they climbed higher into the mountains, leaving behind the false security of familiar trails and established campsites, David and Sarah were walking directly into the most harrowing experience of their lives. The bear following them was patient, intelligent, and absolutely determined to discover what these strange new creatures in its territory were all about. The real test was just beginning, and neither the newlywed couple nor the massive predator tracking them could predict how this deadly encounter would ultimately end. In the wilderness, survival often comes down to split-second decisions, random chance, and the kind of primitive courage that most people never know they possess until their lives depend on it. The mountain peaks surrounding them stood as silent witnesses to an ancient drama, predator and prey, intelligence versus instinct, and the eternal struggle between human vulnerability and the raw, unforgiving power of the natural world.